On the coldest night of that November, Maria Delgado had exactly $23 to her name, and she gave 20 of it to a stranger she would never have picked out of a crowd as anything other than an old man in trouble. She didn't know his last name. She didn't know that the truck rusting out on the shoulder of Route 40 was the only thing he'd let himself drive that whole year, on purpose, or that the hands he wrung together against the cold that night had signed contracts worth more money than her entire hometown had seen in a decade. All she knew, standing under the buzzing lights of Grady's Corner Gas and Grocery with her 7-year-old son asleep in the back seat of a car that needed new brakes, was that a man twice her age was standing at the pump next to her, patting down the pockets of a canvas jacket that had seen better winters, and quietly, without any drama in his voice at all, saying he didn't think he had enough to get home. She had $23 until her next paycheck, 4 days away, and a boy in the back seat who was counting on her for breakfast, and she gave the man 20 of it anyway, folded small, pressed into his glove without a word about paying it back. She thought she was helping a stranger get down the mountain before the roads iced over. She had no idea she was about to become the reason a company worth more than $4 billion would change the whole shape of her town, or that the same kindness that saved him that night would nearly be the thing that got her life taken apart by people who heard about the money before they ever heard about her. My name is Maria Delgado. I'm 29 years old and I live in Harlow Springs, Colorado, a town of about 6,000 people tucked into a valley an hour and a half west of Denver. The kind of place where the elementary school still does a Friday flag ceremony, and everybody's mechanic is also somebody's uncle. I want to tell you what happened the winter a stranger's truck broke down at the gas station where I stopped every night on my way home from my second job, and what he did 5 months later when he came back to find me, because it is the strangest thing that has ever happened to my family. And for about 3 terrifying weeks in the spring, it was also nearly the thing that unraveled us completely. But you have to understand who I was before any of it, because the woman in this story did not help a stranded stranger because she was hoping for anything in return. I need you to believe that part first, completely, before I tell you anything else, because everything that happened afterward only makes sense if you do. I grew up in Harlow Springs, in a small blue house on Larkspur Street that my parents bought the year I was born, and that my mother still lives in today, alone now, since my father passed when I was 19. My mother worked the register at the hardware store on Main for 31 years, and my father drove a snowplow for the county in winter and did odd carpentry the rest of the year. And between the two of them, we were never what anyone would call comfortable, but we were never what anyone would call desperate either. We were just a family that budgeted carefully and helped its neighbors when it could, because that was simply how people did things in that house. I have one sister, Denise, 4 years older than me, and I want to be honest from the very beginning that Denise and I have not been close for a long time, not since our father's funeral, when a disagreement over some of his tools and an old truck turned into something neither of us ever fully repaired. And I mention this now, at the start, because Denise becomes an important part of this story later, in a way I did not see coming and would not have wished on either of us. I had my son, Tommy, when I was 22. His father, a man named Curtis, I dated for a year and a half, left town 2 months after Tommy was born, and has sent in 7 years exactly 4 birthday cards and no child support that ever arrived on time or in full. And I do not say that bitterly. I say it as a fact of the shape of our life, because it matters to understanding just how tightly stretched everything was by the time this story starts. I do not have a husband. I do not have a partner splitting bills with me. I have my mother 2 streets over, who watches Tommy some evenings when my schedule requires it. And I have myself, and for most of Tommy's life that has been enough, but it has never once been easy. And I want to say that plainly instead of dressing it up, because the $20 I'm about to tell you about was not spare money. It was not money I had extra of. It was money I decided, in about 4 seconds, standing in the cold, that I had enough of anyway. By the time Tommy turned 7, I was working 2 jobs to keep us in a small rental on Cedar Lane, the one with the water heater that took 11 minutes to produce anything warmer than lukewarm. Mornings and early afternoons, I worked at Sunny Bright Daycare on Fillmore Street, wrangling a room of 4-year-olds through finger painting and naps for $11 an hour. Work I actually loved most days, if I'm honest, because there is something about a 4-year-old's whole-body joy over a good crayon that resets something in you, no matter how tired you are. But $11 an hour, 32 hours a week, does not cover rent, a car payment, groceries for a growing 7-year-old, and the copays that come with a kid who has mild asthma and needs an inhaler refill more often than the insurance likes to admit. So 4 nights a week after I picked Tommy up from my mother's and got him fed and down for the night, I drove out to the Cortland Business Park on the edge of town and cleaned 3 floors of an office building from 9 at night until 1 in the morning for a small cleaning company that paid modestly but paid on time, which in my experience by then had come to feel like its own kind of luxury. I want to be clear that I am not telling you this to make you feel sorry for us. We were not a tragedy. We were a normal, working, tired American family, the kind there are millions of, and I am telling you exactly how our finances worked, because it explains, in real dollars and cents, exactly how much $20 actually meant to me on that particular Thursday night in November, which is to say, it meant almost everything I had left until Monday. The gas station where all of this started is called Grady's Corner, and it sits at the very edge of town on Route 40, right where the road starts its climb up toward the pass, the last stop before about 40 miles of mountain highway, with nothing on it but pine trees and cell service that comes and goes. I stopped there most nights on my way to the Cortland Business Park because it was the last gas before the climb, and because the owner, a big quiet man named Grady Okafor who bought the station 18 years ago from a man whose name it still carries, kept the coffee decent and never once looked twice at me for buying the cheapest gas station coffee they sold and nursing it through an entire overnight cleaning shift. That November, the mountain had already gotten its first real snow, an early, hard one that caught half the town without its winter tires changed yet, and the temperature had dropped into the teens 3 nights running. The kind of cold that makes your car door handles bite your fingers and your breath hang in front of your headlights like something solid. I want to describe that specific Thursday night carefully, because I have gone over it in my mind so many times since that I could probably draw you a map of exactly where everyone was standing. Tommy was asleep in the back seat, buckled into his booster seat with his stuffed rabbit, Colonel Fluff, tucked under his chin, worn down to a gray, thin-eared version of whatever color he'd started as. I had picked Tommy up late that night because my mother had a dentist appointment run long, and rather than waking him and dragging him inside my mother's house for 20 extra minutes, I decided to just bring him along in the car while I gassed up on the way to my cleaning shift, letting him sleep through it the way kids can sleep through almost anything once they're truly out. I pulled into Grady's Corner a little after 9, the lot nearly empty, just my car and one other vehicle parked slightly crooked near Pump 3, an old faded green pickup truck with a camper shell that had clearly been through some winters of its own, hood up, hazards blinking weakly into the dark. There was a man standing at the open hood, a flashlight held awkwardly under one arm, looking down at an engine the way you look at something you respect but do not understand. And beside him, at the pump, an older gentleman in a heavy canvas work jacket was standing very still with an empty gas can in one hand, patting down his pockets with the other in a way that even from 20 feet away, in bad light, looked like a man who already knew what he was going to find before he found it. I want to be honest that my first thought was the ordinary, slightly wary thought anyone has pulling into a gas station at night and seeing a stranger in obvious trouble. A small flicker of should I even engage with this, followed almost immediately by the second thought, which for me has always come faster than the first, which was, that is somebody's father, out here in the cold. And nobody should have to stand at a gas pump at 9 at night doing math on their own pockets in front of strangers. I parked at Pump 1, close enough to hear without meaning to, and started my own tank. And that was when I heard the younger man at the hood, who I'd later learn was a tow truck driver named Dale, who Grady kept on a short list for exactly these kinds of nights, say to the older man, "Well, sir, I can get you towed into town, but the truck itself isn't going anywhere tonight. That alternator's not a roadside fix. You're looking at a shop in the morning at the earliest." And the older man nodded slowly, like a man absorbing news he'd half expected, and said in a voice that was quieter and steadier than I expected from someone in his situation, "That's all right, son. I understand. I just need to figure out where I'm sleeping tonight and how I'm getting there." And Dale said something about the Harlow Springs Motor Inn on 3rd being the only place still open for walk-ins this late. And the older man nodded again and reached for his wallet. And that was when the patting down of pockets I'd noticed from the car became something more specific, a real search. Jacket pocket, then the other, then the same one again, like the money might have simply reappeared if he looked hard enough. And I watched his shoulders drop a half inch in a way that had nothing showy about it at all. No performance in it, just a private, quiet defeat that he was clearly trying to keep off his face for Dale's benefit. I want to explain exactly what went through my mind in the 15 or 20 seconds it took me to walk over there, because I have been asked since, more times than I can count, whether I hesitated, whether I thought it through, whether some part of me clocked the situation as a scam before I acted. And the honest answer is that I thought about none of that. What I thought about, standing at my own pump with the cold biting through my coat, was a specific memory of my father, 3 winters before he passed, standing in our own driveway in Harlow Springs with his own truck refusing to start on a night nearly this cold. And a neighbor, a man named Walt Dubois who lived 2 houses down, walking over in his slippers with a set of jumper cables before my father had even gotten all the way out of the truck to look under the hood himself. My father talked about that for years afterward, not because jumper cables are a remarkable thing to lend a neighbor, but because of how fast Walt had moved, like helping was simply the next available action, rather than a decision requiring deliberation. I have tried, in the years since my father passed, to be the kind of person who moves like that, and that night at Grady's Corner was, if I am honest, one of maybe a dozen times in my adult life I actually managed it without a half second of hesitation first. I walked over and I said, "Excuse me, sir," I couldn't help but overhear, "is everything all right?" Which is such an ordinary thing to say that I still find it strange how much followed from it. He turned to look at me, and I want to describe his face carefully because I have had a great deal of time since to study it. Sharp gray eyes that missed very little, a neat white beard trimmed close, a face that had clearly spent decades being looked at by other people and had learned, at some point, to give away exactly as much as it chose to, and not one flicker more. But that night, standing in the cold with an empty gas can and an empty wallet, whatever careful control he usually kept over that face had slipped, just slightly, enough that what I saw first was simple embarrassment. An old man caught short in front of strangers. He said, "I'm terribly sorry to be a spectacle, ma'am. My truck's given out and it seems I've also misplaced enough cash to get myself into town for the night," which is, I'll admit, a fairly complete run of bad luck for one Thursday. There was something almost formal in the way he spoke, careful full sentences instead of the clipped, tired talk most people default to at a gas station at 9 at night. And I remember noticing that and filing it away without understanding yet what it meant. I didn't ask his name yet. I didn't ask where he was from or where he'd been headed or any of the questions that would have been perfectly reasonable to ask a stranger before handing him money. I opened my own purse, took out the folded bills I had, $23, all of it in ones and a 5, and I peeled off a 20 and held it out to him and said, "That should cover the room for the night at least, and maybe something hot to eat." He looked at the bill in my hand for a long moment without taking it, long enough that I started to wonder if I'd offended him somehow. And then he said, quietly, "Ma'am, I can't take that. I have no way to pay you back. You don't even know my name." And I said, and this is the part I have replayed most, because I said it without thinking about it at all. It just came out the way true things sometimes do. I said, "I'm not lending it to you, sir. I'm giving it to you. And you don't have to pay back a gift. That's what makes it one." And Dale, the tow truck driver, who had been quietly loading the last of his gear back into his truck bed, stopped what he was doing and looked over at that. And I remember him saying, "Well, I'll be," more to himself than to either of us. The older man took the bill, finally, with a kind of careful reverence that I found almost funny at the time, given it was just a 20, folding it once and tucking it into his breast pocket rather than his wallet, like it belonged somewhere separate from ordinary money, and he said, "Thank you. This is more than money to me tonight. I hope you understand that." And I remember laughing, a little embarrassed myself by then, and saying something like, "It's just $20 and a cold night. Please don't make it into more than that." And he looked at me for a second longer, that same sharp, assessing look I'd notice again months later and understand completely differently, and said, "Ma'am, some nights $20 is exactly as large as it feels, and I don't think you should talk yourself out of that." I asked if he needed a ride into town, since Dale's truck was clearly configured for towing the pickup and not for passengers, and he said no, he'd walk it. It wasn't far, and the cold would do him good after a long day of sitting in a dead truck, which struck me as a strange thing to say, but not strange enough to argue with a man twice my age about at 9 at night with my own son asleep in the car. Before I left, he asked me one question, almost as an afterthought. Turning back as he started up the road toward town, he asked my name, and I told him, "Maria, just Maria." And he nodded once, like he was filing it away carefully, the way you file away something you intend to remember for a long time, and said, "Thank you, Maria." And then he was walking up the shoulder of Route 40 toward the lights of town in that canvas jacket, and I got back in my car, and Tommy stirred slightly in the back seat and asked, half asleep, "Are we there yet, Mama?" And I said almost, "Baby, go back to sleep." And I drove the rest of the way to my cleaning shift without thinking very much more about it at all, the way you don't think very much about most kind things you do in a day, because if you stop to examine every one of them, you'd never get anything else done. I should tell you about the winter that followed, because it was, by any honest measure, a hard one. And I think that matters to the rest of this story more than people expect it to. 2 weeks after that night at Grady's Corner, Tommy came down with a bad flare-up of his asthma that turned into pneumonia, and I spent 4 nights in a row at Harlow Springs Regional, sleeping in a vinyl chair beside his hospital bed. And I want to tell you honestly that the bill for that hospital stay, even with the insurance I carried through the daycare, ran to just over $1,100 after everything settled, an amount that took me the better part of 4 months to pay off in installments while still making rent. I picked up extra shifts at Sunny Bright, covering for a coworker on maternity leave, and I took on a 5th night a week at Cortland Business Park, cleaning an extra floor for an additional $40 a shift. And some weeks that winter I was sleeping 4, maybe 5 hours a night, running on the kind of exhaustion that becomes its own strange, steady state, rather than something you notice fresh each morning. My mother helped where she could, watching Tommy on the nights I picked up extra cleaning work, but she was 63 years old with her own hip pain flaring in the cold, and I tried not to lean on her more than I had to. I did not see the man from Grady's Corner again that winter, not once, and I want to be honest that I thought about him only rarely, mostly in the specific, fleeting way you think about a stranger you helped once. A small, warm flicker of, did that work out for him? Followed almost immediately by the next item on a very long, daily list of things demanding my attention. I did mention it to my coworker at the daycare, a woman named Rosalind Pike, who has worked there almost as long as I have, maybe 2 weeks after it happened, in the offhand way you mention small events from your own week, and she said, "Maria, you gave a total stranger your last $20 at a gas station at night, and I said he needed it more than I needed to prove I was being careful with money that week," and Rosalind just shook her head and said, "That's either the kindest thing I've heard all month or the thing that's going to get you robbed one of these nights," and I told her it was probably both, and we laughed about it. And that was more or less the last time I thought about that night in any sustained way until the following April. Spring came late to Harlow Springs that year, the way it often does at that elevation, with the last hard frost holding on well past when the calendars insisted it should have broken, and by the middle of April the hospital bill was finally paid off. Tommy was healthy and back to his full 7-year-old chaos, and I had allowed myself, for the first time in months, to stop doing quite so much math at the kitchen table every night before bed. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, a warm one, unusually warm for that early in the season, that I was walking out of sunny bright daycare at the end of my shift, keys in hand, thinking about nothing more complicated than whether we had enough eggs at home for dinner, when I noticed a car in the parking lot that did not belong there, a black sedan, the kind of clean, quietly expensive vehicle that simply does not appear in the sunny bright daycare parking lot on Fillmore Street, where the average car is a decade old and held together by the same general philosophy as mine. A man was leaning against the driver's side door, arms crossed, watching the daycare entrance with the patient stillness of someone who had nowhere else he needed to be. And it took me a full 3 or 4 seconds of walking toward my own car before I placed him, because he looked entirely different than the man I remembered from that November night. Gone was the worn canvas jacket, replaced by a charcoal wool coat that fit him with the kind of precision you only get from a tailor, and his white beard, which I remembered as slightly unkempt, was trimmed close and neat, and he stood straighter than I remembered, though I suppose standing in a warm parking lot in April is simply easier on an older man's back than standing at a gas pump in November. But it was the eyes I recognized first and most clearly, sharp and gray and assessing, the same eyes that had looked at that $20 bill in my hand for a long moment before he took it. And when he saw me recognize him, something in his whole posture shifted, a kind of relief, like he'd been more nervous about this moment than his composed exterior led on. He said, "Maria," and I stopped walking, genuinely startled, because in 5 months I had never once expected to see that man again, and certainly never in a black sedan outside my son's daycare. And I said, "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" in the reflexive, slightly wary way anyone would when a well-dressed stranger says their name in a parking lot. And he smiled and said, "We met in November, at Grady's Corner. You gave me $20 for a room at the Motor Inn when my truck's alternator gave out. And I'm afraid I never got the chance to properly thank you or to tell you my actual name, which is Nathaniel Calloway, though most people call me Nate." I want to describe honestly what I felt in that moment, because it was not suspicion exactly, though there was some of that mixed in, and it was not excitement either. It was mostly confusion, the specific, disorienting confusion of 2 entirely separate memories trying to occupy the same face at once. The tired old man in the canvas coat and this composed, clearly well-off gentleman in a wool coat leaning against a car that cost more than I would make in 2 years. I said something like, "You look very different than I remember," which was such an understatement that he actually laughed, a real laugh, warm and a little rueful, and said, "That is very kindly put, Maria, and it is also, I promise you, the entire point of what I need to explain to you. If you have a few minutes and don't mind a rather long story from a stranger who owes you considerably more than $20. I told him I needed to pick up Tommy from my mother's within the hour, which was true, and he said that was more than enough time. And he suggested we sit at the small picnic table at the edge of the daycare parking lot rather than go anywhere else, which I appreciated more than he probably realized, because it meant I never had to get into a car with a stranger to hear whatever he had to say, a small detail that told me something about him before he'd said a single real word of explanation. We sat down, and he reached into his coat, not the canvas one this time, but the wool one, and took out a phone, sleek and clearly expensive. And before he said anything else, he turned the screen toward me and said, "I think it will be faster if I simply show you this first, and then we can talk through what it means." It was a search results page, his name typed into it, Nathaniel Calloway. There was a photograph at the top, a professional one, the kind taken for an annual report, a man in an expensive charcoal suit, standing in front of a wall of glass windows with the Denver skyline behind him. And it took me several long seconds of looking back and forth between that photograph and the man across the picnic table before I truly understood I was looking at the same person. Founder and chairman, Calloway Freight and Logistics. Net worth, according to the article, estimated at $4.3 billion. Operations across 19 states, a fleet of trucks and rail contracts and warehouse infrastructure I did not understand the specifics of, and a name that, once I actually processed it, I realized I had seen before, stenciled on the sides of trucks that passed through Harlow Springs on the state highway on their way to somewhere else. Trucks I had never once connected to an actual living human being, let alone the one sitting across from me at a picnic table outside my son's daycare. I remember my first real reaction was not disbelief exactly, it was almost embarrassment. A hot flush of realizing I had handed a man with $4 billion my last $20, and some absurd involuntary laugh escaped me before I could stop it. And I said, "You didn't have $20, and he said, "No, Maria." That night, in my coat pocket, in cash, I genuinely did not, which is rather the entire point of the whole exercise, and I want to explain that to you properly, because I think you deserve the full explanation, and not just the strange headline of it. He told me the story slowly, in a clear, unhurried voice that had none of the practiced polish I might have expected from a man who presumably gave interviews and spoke to boards of directors for a living. And I am going to tell it to you now the way he told it to me, because I have turned it over in my mind enough times since that I remember it, almost word for word. He had built Calloway Freight from a single delivery truck his own father ran out of a garage in Pueblo in the 1970s, grown it over 5 decades into the kind of company that shows up in business school case studies. And along the way, he said without any self-pity in his voice, just as a plain fact of the life he had chosen, he had slowly lost the ability to know why people were being kind to him. He said, "When you carry the kind of money I carry, Maria, everyone who is generous to you has a reason, and the reason is very often the money, whether they admit it to themselves or not. And after enough years of that, a person starts to lose the ability to trust a kind word from anyone at all. And worse," he said, "you can start to lose the ability to be kind yourself without meaning to, because you forget what it feels like to receive something without an angle attached to it." His wife, Eleanor, had died 6 years earlier, he told me, and he said this part more quietly, looking down at his folded hands on the picnic table rather than at me, that in the last 2 years of her illness, she had been the only person in his life who still treated him like Nate instead of like Calloway Freight and Logistics, and when she was gone, he found himself surrounded by a company, a board, an entire staff of people whose warmth toward him he could no longer separate from their paychecks, and he had made, somewhat impulsively, a decision that his own lawyers and his own adult children thought was, in his words, evidence of a man who had finally cracked under the weight of his own grief. He decided to disappear periodically, deliberately, into small towns along the routes his own trucks traveled, wearing old clothes, carrying only enough cash to be convincingly modest, and driving an old truck he kept for exactly this purpose, to sea, with no company name behind him and no reputation anyone recognized, who would still be decent to a stranger who had absolutely nothing to offer them in return. Harlow Springs, he told me, had not been an accident. Calloway Freight had, for close to a year before that November night, been quietly evaluating a site in this part of Colorado for a new regional distribution hub, the kind of investment that would create, he said, somewhere between 200 and 300 jobs directly and a good deal more indirectly through suppliers and services, the kind of project that could meaningfully change the economic fortunes of a town the size of Harlow Springs for a generation. There were 3 towns on the short list that year, and he had visited all 3 of them personally, incognito, in that same worn canvas jacket, not as Nathaniel Calloway, the chairman, conducting a formal site tour with consultants trailing behind him, but as a stranded stranger testing something no spreadsheet could measure, which was what kind of place this actually was underneath the tax incentives and the zoning paperwork, to the people who might eventually work there. In one of the other 2 towns, he told me plainly, without editorializing, he'd been treated with open suspicion when his truck broke down on a back road outside of town. A shop owner had refused to even look at the vehicle without cash up front, and a woman at a nearby diner had told him, not unkindly but not warmly either, that she couldn't extend credit to strangers, company policy, and sent him on his way with nothing. In the third town, people had mostly just looked past him entirely, the specific, quiet cruelty of being looked through rather than seen. Nobody unkind exactly, just nobody willing to be inconvenienced by a stranger's bad luck. And in Harlow Springs, at Grady's Corner on a bitterly cold November night, a woman with a sleeping child in her back seat, and, as he would later confirm through means he was careful to explain to me in a way that didn't feel invasive, exactly $23 to her name until her next paycheck had given him every bit of what she reasonably could without being asked twice, and had specifically refused to let him think of it as a debt. I sat there at that picnic table. Maria Delgado, 29 years old, single mother of one, 2 jobs, a car that needed new brakes, and listened to a $4.3 billion man tell me that I had, without ever knowing it, been the deciding factor in where he was about to build a facility that would employ hundreds of people in the town where I was born and raised. And I want to tell you honestly that what I felt in that moment was not triumph or vindication. It was something closer to a strange, dizzy vertigo, the sensation of the ground tilting slightly under a chair that had not actually moved, and underneath that vertigo, something quieter and heavier, a kind of grief for every single week. That winter I had done exhausting math at my own kitchen table, wondering how we would make it to the next paycheck, never once knowing that the answer to that private, exhausting question had, this whole time, apparently mattered to the entire future of my town. When I finally spoke, after a silence that felt much longer than it probably was, what came out of my mouth was not any of the questions you'd expect from someone who'd just learned all of this. I said, "Are you doing all right now? Is your back okay? That road up to the pass gets so cold at night." And I asked it before I even fully understood I was asking it, because some part of me was still simply worried about the tired old man from the gas pump, and Nate went very still when I said that. And something in his face changed, and he said quietly, "Maria, in the 24 or so towns and small interactions like this over the last several years, you are the very first person who, upon learning who I actually am, asked first whether I was going to be all right. Every single other person's first question, without exception, has been some version of what happens now for me." He told me then, and I want to explain that I did not ask for any of this, that he intended to do several things, some connected to the business decision and some entirely separate from it, and he was careful, almost painstakingly careful, to draw a hard line between the two, because he said he did not want me carrying around any confusion later about whether my kindness had purchased the town's good fortune or simply happened to align with a decision that stood on its own. The distribution hub, he told me, had already been decided in his own mind close to 2 months earlier, based on infrastructure, highway access, workforce, and what he called the human diligence of the town, which no consultant spreadsheet could have measured for him. That decision, he said, was final and had nothing whatsoever to do with what he was about to offer me personally. For me personally, he said, he wanted to do something that reflected the fact that I had given him that $20, believing completely that he was simply a stranded old man with absolutely nothing riding on it beyond a cold night and an empty gas can. He wanted to set up an education fund for Tommy that would cover every year of school he wanted, all the way through graduate school if he chose it, structured so that the money existed entirely outside of my own finances and could never be touched for anything else. Not rent, not a car repair, not an emergency, nothing but Tommy's education, protected specifically so that no future hardship of mine could ever eat into it by accident or necessity. He wanted to pay off what remained of my car loan and put me in a newer, safer vehicle outright, no loan attached, because he said, with a small, dry note in his voice, that a woman who drives an unreliable car home from a midnight cleaning shift on mountain roads in winter should not have to worry about brakes on top of everything else. And he wanted, he said, his voice slowing down here in a way that told me we had reached the part he had rehearsed least, to set up a fund in my name directly, structured by his own financial team, that would allow me to leave the overnight cleaning job entirely if I chose to, and to work at Sunny Bright Daycare, if I still wanted to work there at all, purely because I loved it and not because I needed the paycheck to survive. I want to describe honestly what was happening in my body while he said all of this, because it was not joy, not yet. It was something closer to a physical disorientation, my hands flat on the picnic table like I needed to feel something solid under them. And I remember the first fully formed thought that arrived once the vertigo settled enough to let a thought through. And it surprised me, because it was not about the money at all. It was, I need to call my mother. Not for permission. I have never once needed my mother's permission for a decision in my adult life, but because she had lived every single version of the hard math at that kitchen table alongside me in whatever ways a mother 2 streets over can, and it did not feel like a thing I was allowed to sit with completely alone. I told Nate I needed time, and that I needed to pick up my son, and that all of this was more than I could process, standing at a picnic table with an hour before I had to be somewhere. And he said, "Of course," and reached into his coat and handed me a card. Plain white, heavier stock than an ordinary business card, with a name on it I hadn't heard yet, Vivian Marsh, and a phone number. And he said, "This is my attorney. She handles matters like this personally and discreetly, and there is absolutely no obligation attached to calling her. None of what I've described requires anything further from you at all if you decide, even after thinking about it, that you'd rather I simply thank you and go on my way. I want you to know that option exists too, and it is a completely acceptable one." I drove to my mother's house that afternoon with my hands actually trembling slightly on the wheel, and I picked up Tommy, who ran at me the way he always does, full 7-year-old velocity, and I hugged him longer than the moment probably called for, and my mother, watching from the doorway, said, "Maria, honey, you look like you saw a ghost. What happened?" And I said, "Mama, I need to sit down and tell you something, and I don't think you're going to believe it." And she said, "Try me. I've believed stranger things from you before," which was not remotely true, but it made me laugh anyway. The first real laugh I'd managed since the picnic table. And I sat at her kitchen table, the same one I'd done homework at as a child, and told her the entire story from the beginning, the gas station, the $20, the black sedan outside Sunnybright, all of it. My mother listened without interrupting, which for her is its own kind of remarkable. And when I finished, she sat quietly for a long moment. And then she said, "Your father would have done exactly what you did at that gas pump. You know that." And I said, "I know, Mama. That's part of why I did it." And she nodded. And then, being my mother, being a woman who had spent 31 years at a hardware store register, watching every kind of person come through that door, she said, "And now I need you to promise me something before you call that lawyer, before any of this becomes real in a legal sense. Promise me you will not tell your sister a single detail of this until you have a plan for how you're going to tell her. Because Maria, I love Denise. She is my daughter, same as you. But grief and money together have already broken this family once, over your father's old truck of all things, and I will not watch it happen again over something this size." I promised her that night, and I meant it, and I want to tell you now, because it matters to everything that comes later, that I broke that promise within 6 weeks, not through any carelessness of my own, but through a chain of small, ordinary events that I could not have prevented, no matter how careful I tried to be. And I will get to exactly how that happened. But first I need to tell you about the weeks that followed the picnic table conversation, because they were stranger and slower than you might expect, full of lawyers and documents rather than any of the dramatic gestures you might imagine from a story like this one. I called Vivian Marsh 2 days later from my kitchen table with the card Nate had given me sitting in front of me like it might change its mind about being real if I looked away from it too long. Vivian's voice on the phone was calm and precise in a way that put me at ease almost immediately, the voice of someone who had clearly had this exact conversation, or some close version of it, more than once before. And she said, "Maria, I want to start by telling you that nothing about this conversation obligates you to anything, and I want you to feel free to ask every question you have, even the ones that feel rude to ask a lawyer, especially those, actually, because those are usually the important ones." I asked her bluntly whether this was some kind of scheme, whether Nate Calloway actually existed the way he said he did, whether I was about to sign something that would somehow cost me more than it gave me. And Vivian, to her credit, did not seem offended by any of it. She said, "Those are exactly the right questions, and I'm going to answer all of them plainly." She confirmed, and later sent me documentation confirming that Nathaniel Calloway was in fact the founder and chairman of Calloway Freight and Logistics, a publicly discussed company with public financial filings. I could look up myself if I wanted to, which I did. That night, alone at my kitchen table after Tommy was asleep, scrolling through news articles about the company on my phone until nearly 1 in the morning. The same time I would once have been finishing a cleaning shift at Cortland Business Park, Vivian explained, over that first call and 2 more that followed it across the next 10 days, exactly what was being proposed, and she was scrupulous, almost aggressively so, about making sure I understood every piece of it before signing anything. The education trust for Tommy would be established through an irrevocable structure that neither Nate nor I could later access or redirect for any other purpose, funded fully at signing, managed by an independent trustee at a financial institution in Denver, with the funds released according to Tommy's actual educational needs as they arose: tuition, books, housing, whatever the years required. The vehicle was simpler, an outright purchase of a newer, safer SUV, titled In My Name, no loan, no lien, delivered within the month. And the personal fund, which Vivian was most careful about of all of it, would be structured as a diversified trust generating income I could draw from, rather than a single lump sum dropped into an ordinary checking account. Specifically, she explained, because lump sums invite a particular kind of chaos that she had seen destroy people before. Family members surfacing, scam artists circling, entire life savings gone within 18 months to bad investments or worse. And Nate had specifically instructed her to structure it in a way that would protect me from exactly that pattern, even if it meant the money arrived to me more slowly and more carefully than a check I could simply cash. I signed the paperwork on a Thursday in early May, almost exactly 6 months after that night at Grady's Corner, in Vivian's temporary office in a shared workspace in Denver, my mother having driven down with me and sat in the waiting room the entire time. And I remember Vivian walking me through every single page, slowly, asking after each section whether I understood it and whether I had questions. And only once did she pause and say, "Off the clock now, not as your lawyer, but as a person who has seen a few of these situations. Maria, whatever happens next, and I promise you, something will happen next. Some cousin you haven't spoken to in a decade, some financial advisor who finds you through a mutual friend. Protect the trust structure with your whole chest. Don't let anyone talk you into converting any of this into cash they can get their hands on, because the entire design of what we've built is meant to survive exactly that kind of pressure, but only if you let it." I did not understand, sitting in that office signing my name next to little yellow tabs, how quickly Vivian's warning would turn out to be necessary, or how close it would come to being right about the specific shape the danger would take. The new SUV arrived on a Saturday in mid-May, delivered by a dealership out of Denver rather than bought off any lot in Harlow Springs, which I had specifically asked for, hoping to keep the whole thing quiet. But Harlow Springs is a town of 6,000 people, and a brand new vehicle sitting in the driveway of a woman everyone in town knew to be stretched thin. 2 jobs deep is not the kind of thing that stays unnoticed for more than about 4 days. Rosalind from the daycare asked me about it first, gently, the way you ask a friend something you're worried might be a sore subject, and I told her a version of the truth, that an old family situation had resolved unexpectedly, and I'd come in to a little help, which was true as far as it went, and I asked her, directly, to please not make it a topic of conversation at work, and she agreed without pushing, because Rosalind has always respected a closed door when I've needed one. But it was Tommy. In the entirely innocent way 7-year-olds carry information without any sense of its weight, who actually broke it open, At school, in the second week of May, his teacher had the class do a simple show-and-tell exercise about something new at home, and Tommy, utterly delighted by the new car and by a conversation he'd half overheard between me and my mother about Calloway Freight and a company doing something for our town, stood up in front of his second-grade class and announced, with total 7-year-old confidence, that his mom's friend was a billionaire named Mr. Calloway, who was building a big truck building in Harlow Springs and had given his family a new car and money for college. His teacher, understandably, mentioned it to me at pickup that day with a raised eyebrow and a careful, "Is there something going on I should know about, Maria?" And I remember standing in that school hallway feeling the exact sensation of a secret I had tried so carefully to protect, slipping through my fingers through the one channel I had never even considered guarding. My own son's proud, unfiltered mouth. Within a week it was, in the specific way news moves through a town the size of Harlow Springs, more or less common knowledge, at least in outline, that Maria Delgado from Sunny Bright Daycare had some connection to the billionaire behind the new Calloway Freight distribution hub everyone had started seeing surveyors and site engineers around town for. People were, for the most part, kind about it. A few congratulations at the grocery store. Grady himself stopping me at his station to say, "Whatever happened, Maria? I'm glad it happened to somebody who deserves it," which meant more to me than he probably realized. But word like that does not stay contained to a town of 6,000 people, not when it involves a company as visible regionally as Calloway Freight. And it was my sister Denise, 4 years older than me and living 40 minutes away in Granby, who heard about it not from me directly, but from our cousin Patty, who heard about it from someone at her church whose husband worked construction and had heard about the site development contract. Denise called me on a Tuesday evening in late May, nearly 7 months after that night at Grady's Corner, and I want to describe honestly what that call felt like, because I had genuinely hoped, in some quiet corner of myself, that this particular reunion might happen on gentler terms than it did. She did not open with hello, or how are you, or even Tommy's name. She opened with, "Is it true, Maria? Is it actually true that some billionaire is just handing you money?" And I said, "Denise, it's complicated, and can we please talk about this in person instead of over the phone?" And she said, "No, I would like to understand right now why you didn't call your own sister the second this happened." And I stood in my kitchen holding the phone and felt the old, familiar tightness that conversations with Denise have carried since our father's funeral. And I said, honestly, because Mama and I agreed I should wait until I understood it myself before I brought anyone else into it. And Denise's voice went sharp in a way I remembered from exactly one other conversation in my life, the one over Dad's old truck. And she said, "So you told Mama before you told me. That's rich, Maria. That's really rich, considering everything." I want to be honest that I understand now, with some distance, why Denise reacted the way she did, even though the way she reacted caused real damage before it was over. Denise's life had gone differently than mine in the years since our father died, a divorce 4 years back that left her with 2 teenagers and a mortgage on a house in Granby that was underwater more months than it wasn't, a job at an insurance office that she has never once described to me as anything but exhausting. And I think, if I'm being completely fair to her, hearing that her younger sister had somehow landed in the middle of a windfall of a size neither of us could previously have imagined touched something in Denise that had very little to do with me specifically and a great deal to do with years of her own financial exhaustion finally finding somewhere to point itself. That does not excuse what came next, but I think it explains the shape of it, and I have tried since to hold both of those truths at the same time, that Denise was wrong about several important things, and that Denise was also genuinely struggling in ways I had not fully appreciated until all of this forced the subject into the open. 3 days after that phone call, Denise showed up at my house on Cedar Lane unannounced, on a Friday evening, with a man I had never met standing slightly behind her on my front step. A man in his 50s in a gray sport coat that looked expensive in the specific, slightly try-hard way that expensive things look on people trying to convince you they've always had money, and Denise said, "Maria, this is Roy Pruitt. He's a financial consultant. He's helped some folks at my church with situations kind of like yours." And I just think, Before you sign your whole future away to some billionaire's lawyer, you ought to at least hear an independent opinion from somebody who isn't on his payroll. I let them in, mostly because I did not want to have this particular argument on my front step where the neighbors could hear it. And Tommy was thankfully at my mother's for the evening, and I sat across my own living room from a sister I had barely spoken to in a friendly way in 5 years, and a stranger in a gray sport coat who had, I noticed within about 90 seconds, an extremely practiced way of talking that reminded me, uncomfortably, of infomercials I usually muted. Roy Pruitt introduced himself as an independent wealth advisor, said he'd spent, quote, the better part of 2 decades helping ordinary families navigate sudden financial windfalls, mentioned a few vague credentials that I did not recognize and did not think to write down at the time, and then said, Maria, I'll be straight with you, because that's the only way I know how to operate. What your sister has described to me sounds like a trust structure designed to keep you dependent on this Calloway fellow's goodwill indefinitely. Income you can draw from, sure, but never real ownership, never real freedom. And I've seen this pattern before. Wealthy men who feel guilty about something and want to control exactly how their guilt gets spent, dressed up as generosity. I want to be honest that some small part of what he said landed uncomfortably close to a worry I had actually had myself. The specific discomfort of money that came with structure and oversight attached, rather than simply arriving as mine to do with as I pleased, and Roy Pruitt was clearly skilled enough at his particular con, because I did not yet understand it as a con, to locate that one genuine anxiety and press directly on it. He suggested, gently at first, that I have his firm review the trust documents before finalizing anything further, that I consider petitioning to have a portion of the education trust converted to a direct disbursement I could manage myself, quote, so that a mother has real control over her own child's future, instead of some Denver law firm deciding for her, and that I let him introduce me to what he called a more flexible investment vehicle that could grow the funds faster than what he characterized, with a dismissive little wave, as an overly conservative trustee arrangement designed more to protect the Calloway family's reputation than my own interests. Denise, watching this exchange from my own couch, kept nodding along in a way that made something in my stomach tighten, and at one point she said, Maria, I just don't want you to end up controlled by this the way Dad's whole life felt controlled by not having enough. And I remember feeling a flash of real anger at that, because it was such a strange, backward use of our father's memory. And I said, Denise, this isn't the same thing at all. And she said, isn't it? Some man decides how your money gets spent, and you just go along with it because he's rich and confident and used to people doing what he says. And I said, that's not remotely what's happening here, and I could feel my own voice getting sharper than I wanted it to in my own living room. Roy left behind a business card and a folder of what he called preliminary recommendations, printed on nice paper with a logo that looked, now that I know what I know, clearly designed to evoke a much larger and more established firm than whatever Roy Pruitt actually operated out of, and after they left, I sat alone in my living room for a long time before I did what I probably should have done the moment Denise mentioned his name, which was call Vivian Marsh directly. Vivian listened to my entire description of the meeting without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Maria, can you read me the name on that business card again, slowly? And I did, and I heard her typing on the other end of the line, and after about 30 seconds, she said, in a voice that had gone noticeably more careful than her usual measured tone, Maria, I need you to not sign anything, not one page, that this man or anyone associated with him gives you, and I need you to tell me if he asked for any personal information, account numbers, social security details, anything at all. And something in the specific seriousness of her voice made my stomach drop in a way it had not dropped, even during the argument with Denise. Roy Pruitt, it turned out, once Vivian's firm ran a proper search that took them less than a day, was not a licensed financial advisor of any kind in the state of Colorado, had operated under at least 2 other names in 2 other states over the previous 6 years, both times in connection with elder financial exploitation cases that had resulted in civil judgments against him, though no criminal conviction had ever stuck because his victims, embarrassed or exhausted or both, had mostly declined to pursue the cases to trial. His actual pattern, Vivian explained, gently but plainly, was to locate people who had recently come into unexpected money, usually through an inheritance or a legal settlement, insinuate himself through a family connection or a shared community like a church, and convince them to redirect protected or structured funds into investment vehicles he personally controlled, vehicles that inevitably underperformed or simply evaporated within a year or two, by which point Roy Pruitt had typically already moved to a different state under a slightly different name. I sat with that information for a long time after I hung up with Vivian, and the fear I felt was not primarily for myself, because Vivian's trust structure, exactly as she'd warned me back in her office, had been built specifically to resist this kind of pressure. No lump sum for Roy Pruitt to redirect, no single signature that could unravel the whole thing. The fear I felt was for Denise, because whatever Roy Pruitt's actual angle was with my situation, having failed to get anywhere with me directly, I did not think for 1 second he would simply disappear quietly, and I was right to worry about that, though not in the specific way I expected. What actually happened over the following 3 weeks was that Roy Pruitt, unable to get anywhere near the actual trust structure protecting Tommy's education fund or my own income, pivoted his entire approach toward Denise directly, and I did not learn the full extent of it until well after the damage had already been done. He had, it turned out, been cultivating a relationship with Denise for close to 2 months before that Friday night he showed up at my door, not because he had any real interest in helping her, but because Denise, struggling with her mortgage and freshly aware, through our family situation, that meaningful money now existed somewhere within reach of her own family, made an easier and more vulnerable target than I did, once I had a lawyer like Vivian Marsh standing between him and anything he wanted. He convinced Denise, over the course of those 3 weeks, using a mixture of genuine-sounding financial jargon and a carefully cultivated warmth that I now understand was entirely manufactured, to take out a home equity loan against her already struggling mortgage in Granby, framing it to her as a bridge investment that would, quote, position her to help Maria manage the family's new resources more wisely, and would also, coincidentally, generate returns of her own that could finally get her out from under her financial stress. I found out about it the way I found out about most things that summer, through my mother, who Denise had called late one night in a state my mother described to me afterward as somewhere between crying and shouting, saying she'd given Roy $18,000, nearly everything the home equity loan had freed up, and he had stopped answering his phone 4 days earlier, and the investment account he'd set her up with, some platform she'd never heard of before him, now showed a balance of absolutely nothing. And there was no paper trail leading back to any actual financial institution that could explain where the money had actually gone. I want to be honest about what I felt when my mother told me this, sitting in my kitchen with Tommy already asleep down the hall, because it was not the small, ungenerous flicker of I told her, so that I am ashamed to admit passed through me for about half a second before something larger and more urgent replaced it entirely. What I felt, mostly, was a kind of cold, focused fear for my sister, because $18,000 against an already underwater mortgage in Granby was not a setback Denise could absorb the way I might have been able to absorb it even before any of this started with Nate. It was the kind of loss that could genuinely cost her the house her 2 teenagers were living in, and whatever our history was, whatever hard things had passed between us since our father's funeral, I did not for 1 single second consider letting that happen without doing everything in my power to stop it. I called Denise that night, and I want to tell you that conversation went very differently than the one 3 weeks earlier had. She answered crying, actually crying, in a way I had not heard from my sister since we were teenagers, and she said, "Maria, I am so stupid. I am so unbelievably stupid." And I said, "Denise, you are not stupid. You got lied to by a professional liar. There's a difference. And please, please let me help you." And there was a long silence on the line. And then Denise said, quietly, "Why would you help me after how I've treated you the last 3 weeks?" And I said, "Because you're my sister, Denise. And because Mama raised us both to know that you show up for family, especially on the weeks they don't deserve it," which is something our own mother had said to me once, a long time ago, about a foil-wrapped plate sent to a struggling neighbor. Though I did not explain that reference to Denise that night, I simply meant it the way I'd been taught to mean it. I called Vivian Marsh first thing the next morning. And I want to note here that Vivian did something in that conversation that told me a great deal about who Nate had chosen to represent this whole process, because she did not hesitate for even a moment before saying, "Maria, let me make a call, and I'll get back to you within the hour." What Vivian did, it turned out, over the following 2 days, was coordinate with a financial crimes unit within the Colorado Attorney General's office that already had an open file on a man matching Roy Pruitt's description, operating under a different name in Boulder County. And she connected Denise directly with an investigator there, and separately, without any fanfare or announcement, arranged for a portion of my own newly established personal trust to extend Denise an emergency bridge loan sufficient to cover her mortgage payments for the next 4 months, while the fraud investigation and any possible recovery of funds played out, structured, Vivian was careful to specify, as an actual loan with simple, generous terms rather than a gift, because she said, and I agreed completely, that a gift in that moment would have done more harm than good to whatever Denise and I were rebuilding between us. Nate, when I told him all of this on a phone call about a week later, listened quietly and then said something I have thought about often since. He said, "Maria, I want you to know that none of what my team did for your sister was contingent on anything, and I also want you to know that I understand, better than almost anyone, how quickly money can turn family into strangers, or strangers into family, sometimes in the very same week. And I am glad, genuinely glad, that in your case it seems to be doing the second thing rather than the first, even if it took a frightening few weeks to get there." Roy Pruitt was arrested in Boulder County 6 weeks later, in the middle of what investigators believed was an attempt to run the same scheme on a widow who had recently settled a wrongful death lawsuit, and Denise was asked to give a statement, which she did, sitting across from an investigator for nearly 3 hours, going through every text message and every phone call, and I sat with her in the parking lot afterward while she cried, this time in a way that seemed to me less like shame and more like relief, finally landing somewhere it could rest. The $18,000 was never fully recovered. Only about $6,000 of it eventually clawed back through the state's victim restitution process, but the bridge loan Vivian had arranged carried Denise through the worst of it, and by the end of that summer, she had refinanced her mortgage on better terms with my mother and me as informal co-signers on the paperwork. A level of financial entanglement between the three of us that would have been unthinkable to any of us back in November. I want to tell you honestly that Denise and I did not become close overnight, the way a tidy version of this story might suggest. What we did was start having dinner together every other Sunday, a habit that began awkwardly, mostly silent. The two of us and my mother and Denise's 2 teenagers and Tommy all crowded around my mother's kitchen table, and slowly over the following months turned into something that actually resembled a family again. Not because $18,000 taught either of us a lesson exactly, but because nearly losing something forced both of us to actually look at what we still had left of each other underneath years of small accumulated hurt. Denise told me once, on one of those Sunday evenings, drying dishes side by side at my mother's sink, that she thought some part of her had needed to almost lose everything before she could let herself need me again, without it feeling like losing an old argument we'd never actually finished, and I told her I understood that completely, because some part of me had needed the same thing in reverse. I thought, by midsummer, that the hardest part of all of this was behind me, the frightening weeks with Roy Pruitt resolved, my sister and I rebuilding something real, the trust structure for Tommy's education standing exactly as solid as Vivian had promised it would. I did not expect the next serious threat to this whole arrangement to come from an entirely different direction, from inside Calloway Freight and logistics itself, and I want to tell you about that part carefully, because it frightened me in a completely different way than Roy Pruitt had. A colder, more procedural kind of fear. The fear of watching something get taken apart by people using entirely legal methods and calm, reasonable-sounding language. It started in late July, when Vivian called me on a Wednesday morning, her voice carrying a formality I had not heard from her since our very first conversation, and she said, "Maria, I need to explain something to you. And I need you to understand that whatever happens with this, my firm and Nate personally are committed to making sure you and Tommy are protected. But there is a process starting that you should hear about directly from me rather than through rumor. What had happened," she explained, "was that a member of Calloway Freight's board of directors, a man named Preston Whitlock, who had served on the board for over a decade and who had never fully supported the Harlow Springs distribution hub project in the first place, arguing internally that a location closer to an existing rail corridor in Wyoming would have served the company's logistics needs more efficiently, had used the public reporting around my personal arrangement with Nate as leverage to reopen the entire site decision at the board level. Whitlock's argument, as Vivian described it to me, was not framed as an attack on me personally, which somehow made it feel worse rather than better. It was framed in the careful, bloodless language of corporate governance, that Nathaniel Calloway, as chairman, had made a site selection decision partly influenced by a personal relationship with a private individual, that this represented a potential conflict of interest requiring board review, and that the fiduciary duty owed to shareholders required an independent evaluation of whether Harlow Springs truly represented the optimal site or whether personal sentiment had improperly weighted the decision. Buried within that same argument, and this was the part that frightened me most, was a suggestion that any trusts or funds established by Nate personally in connection with the Harlow Springs decision should be reviewed by outside counsel to ensure they did not constitute an improper use of goodwill intended to influence public perception of a business decision, language that, Vivian explained grimly, could in the worst-case scenario be used to argue that Tommy's education trust and my own personal fund had been improperly commingled with a corporate decision in a way that might expose them to legal challenge or delay. I want to be honest about how frightened I was hearing this, because it was a fear with a completely different texture than the fear I'd felt about Roy Pruitt. Roy Pruitt had been a con man I could understand instinctively, a bad actor doing an obviously bad thing. And once Vivian and the Attorney General's office got involved, the danger had a clear shape and a clear resolution. This was different. This was a company's own internal board process, entirely legal, entirely proper on its face, moving through channels I did not understand and could not personally influence in any way, threatening to unwind not just the distribution hub that hundreds of Harlow Springs families were already counting on. Jobs had already been posted. Some people had already given notice at other positions, anticipating the hub's opening, but also the very structure protecting Tommy's education and my own family's stability. Nate called me himself that same evening, and I could hear in his voice something I had not heard from him before, a controlled, careful anger that he was clearly working hard to keep out of his tone for my benefit. He said, "Maria, I want you to hear this from me directly and not filtered through a board memo. Preston Whitlock is using you and your son as a lever in an argument he has actually been trying to win for over a year about a rail corridor in Wyoming that would save the company perhaps 4% in long-term shipping costs, a percentage he has never once been able to make the actual numbers support when pressed on it directly. This has never, not for one single day, been about you. It has always been about Preston Whitlock wanting his preferred site, and you have simply become the most convenient weapon available to him this particular quarter." He told me the board vote on whether to formally reopen the site decision was scheduled for the second week of August, just under 3 weeks away, and that he intended to fight it directly. But he was careful, in a way I appreciated even through my fear, not to promise me an outcome he could not guarantee. He said, "Maria, I chair that board, but I do not own this company outright. I answer to shareholders same as any other public company chairman, and I will not lie to you and tell you the outcome is certain, because it is not, and I think you deserve honesty about that more than you deserve false comfort. What I can tell you is that Tommy's education trust and your personal fund were structured deliberately as private philanthropic gifts entirely separate from any corporate decision-making process, executed through my personal estate rather than through any Calloway freight entity, specifically anticipating that someone, someday, might try exactly this argument. Vivian built that separation into the documents from the very first draft, and I do not believe, and she does not believe, that Whitlock's argument can actually reach those trusts, no matter how the board vote goes. But the distribution hub itself, the jobs, the future of your town, that decision genuinely could be reopened, and I am not going to pretend to you that isn't a real risk. I want to describe what those 3 weeks in early August felt like for me, because they were, in some ways, harder than the weeks with Roy Pruitt, precisely because there was so little I personally could do about any of it. I could not call an investigator. I could not sit across a table from Preston Whitlock and simply be decent to him the way I'd been decent to Nate at a gas pump, because Preston Whitlock did not want anything from me personally. He wanted a rail corridor in Wyoming and the political win of having overturned his chairman's decision. And there was no version of kindness I could offer that would move that particular calculation even slightly. What I could do, it turned out, once word of the board vote began circulating through Harlow Springs in the specific way news travels through a small town facing an uncertain future, was simply be present and let the town be present alongside me, and that ended up mattering more than I expected. Grady from the gas station was the first to hear it through a cousin who worked logistics somewhere in the industry, and he came by the daycare one afternoon in late July, which he had never once done in all the years I'd known him, and he said, "Maria, I heard there might be trouble with the hub. Is there anything an ordinary person can actually do about a corporate board vote?" And I told him honestly, "I don't know, Grady. I don't fully understand how any of this works myself, but it turned out there was something, and it came from a direction I did not expect." Vivian Marsh, in one of our calls that week, mentioned, almost as an aside, that shareholder input, particularly in the form of organized public comment ahead of a board vote of this significance, was sometimes taken more seriously by boards than companies like to publicly admit, especially when a company's public reputation was tied, as Calloway Freight's increasingly was, to stories already circulating locally about the Harlow Springs decision. She was careful to say she was not asking me to organize anything, that this was entirely my own choice to make, but she thought I should know the option existed. I want to be honest that I did not immediately love the idea of turning my own family's situation into some kind of public campaign, but I thought about the people already counting on those jobs, families who had told me directly at the grocery store, at Tommy's school, that a cousin or a spouse had already put in for a transfer or given notice somewhere else anticipating the hub's opening. And I thought about what it would mean to those specific families if Preston Whitlock's Wyoming argument won, simply because nobody outside the boardroom ever said anything at all. So I wrote a letter, a genuinely difficult letter to write, addressed to the full Calloway Freight Board, not defending myself particularly, but describing Harlow Springs plainly, the way I would describe it to anyone: the closed feed store, the consolidated school district, the particular ache of watching a town you love slowly shrink around you for lack of exactly the kind of investment this hub represented. And I asked Grady and Rosalind and my mother, and even, at her own insistence, Denise, whether they would be willing to add their own names and their own few sentences to it. More people wanted to than I expected. Within 4 days, the letter had grown to include statements from over 60 Harlow Springs residents, some just a sentence or two. Walter Iverson, who ran the feed store before it closed, writing, "Simply, this town has been waiting a long time for somebody to bet on it again. Please don't take that bet back over a spreadsheet." And Mr. Castillo, the retired principal of the Consolidated Elementary School, writing at some length about what youth flight out of towns like ours actually costs a community over a generation, the kind of cost that never shows up on any single balance sheet, but that everyone who has lived through it understands completely. Vivian submitted the letter formally to the board's corporate secretary as public shareholder adjacent comment ahead of the scheduled vote, and I want to be honest that I had no real idea whether it would matter at all. The board meeting happened on a Tuesday in the second week of August in Denver, and I was not present for it. Board meetings of that kind are not open to the general public, but Nate called me that evening, and I could hear, even before he said anything, in the particular quality of the silence on the line before he spoke, that whatever had happened, it had happened the way he'd hoped. He said, "Maria, the board voted 6-3 against reopening the site decision. The hub stays in Harlow Springs. Fully approved. Construction timeline unchanged. And I want you to know that your letter, and specifically Mr. Castillo's section about generational cost, was quoted directly, twice, by two different board members during the discussion, in ways that I do not believe Preston Whitlock's rail corridor argument ever recovered from." I asked him what happened to Whitlock, and Nate was quiet for a moment, and then said, "He'll remain on the board. He's entitled to that as a matter of governance, and I have no interest in making this personal in a way it was never really about. But I don't imagine he'll find much appetite among the other directors the next time he wants to relitigate a site decision using a family's private circumstances as ammunition. There's a cost to overplaying a hand like that in a room full of people who have to keep working with you afterward, and I think he understands that now considerably better than he did 3 weeks ago." I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after that call, in my own kitchen. Tommy already asleep down the hall, and I felt something settle in my chest that I had not fully realized was still unsettled since that Wednesday morning Vivian first called me about Whitlock's maneuvering. It was not quite relief. Relief feels lighter than what I actually felt. It was something closer to a kind of exhausted gratitude. The specific gratitude of watching a town full of people who had very little collectively decide to stand up for something bigger than any one of their own individual situations. Because I want to be honest that most of the 60-some people who signed that letter had no personal stake in my situation specifically. They signed it because they wanted the jobs. They wanted their town to have a future. And it happened that my particular circumstance was the vehicle through which that fight became winnable. Construction on the Calloway Freight Distribution Hub broke ground the first week of September on a stretch of flat land off Route 40 that had sat empty and mostly forgotten since a defunct lumber operation closed there sometime in the 90s. And the town held what amounted to a genuine small celebration the day the first excavators arrived. Grady handing out free coffee from a folding table set up at the edge of the site, half the town standing around in the early autumn cold just to watch the ground actually get broken on something that had, for most of the summer, felt uncertain enough that people were almost afraid to hope for it out loud. I brought Tommy, who was far more interested in the excavators themselves than in anything they represented, which felt honestly like exactly the right scale of reaction for a 7-year-old to have. And I stood at the edge of that crowd next to my mother, and for the first time in longer than I could easily remember, next to Denise as well, the 4 of us, my mother, Denise, Tommy, and me, watching machinery move dirt that would eventually become a building employing a few hundred of our neighbors. Nate flew in for the groundbreaking, not with any fanfare, no press conference, no ribbon. He specifically asked the local paper not to make more of his presence than the story genuinely warranted, and he stood at the edge of that same crowd in an ordinary wool coat, recognized by almost nobody except the small circle of us who actually knew him. And afterward, when most of the crowd had drifted back toward town, he asked if I had time for a cup of coffee before he flew back to Denver, and I said yes, and we ended up at a small diner on Main Street called the Alpine Kettle, a place I'd eaten at maybe twice a year my whole life, mostly for birthdays, because it was slightly too nice for an ordinary Tuesday budget. It was there, over coffee, that Nate told me something about Eleanor that he had not told me back at that first picnic table conversation, something he said he had been waiting for the right unhurried moment to share. He said that, in the last good year of their marriage, before her illness took hold in earnest, Eleanor used to make a simple beef stew on Sunday evenings, not from any written recipe, just from memory of her own mother's kitchen in a small town in Nebraska where she'd grown up, and that he had spent Since her death, a strange and quietly obsessive amount of time trying to find anything close to that same taste at restaurants across however many states his trucks traveled through. Without much success, most versions coming out either too rich or too thin, missing some specific humble balance he could recognize instantly, but not describe to any chef who tried to replicate it for him. The Alpine Kettle, it turned out, served a beef stew on Tuesdays that the owner, an older woman named Peggy Lukes, made from her own grandmother's recipe, and Nate told me quietly, looking down at his coffee rather than at me, that it was the closest thing he had found anywhere in 5 years of quietly searching, close enough that the first time he'd eaten it, during one of his earliest incognito visits to Harlow Springs, the year before we ever met at Grady's Corner, he had needed to step outside afterward and stand in the parking lot for several minutes before he trusted his own composure enough to drive. I asked him gently whether that made coming back to Harlow Springs harder or easier, given everything the stew apparently carried with it, and he considered the question with the same careful, unhurried seriousness he brought to most things, and said, "Both, Maria, somehow both at once." It's gotten easier to sit with over the years without getting any less sharp, and I've come to believe that's simply what missing someone properly is supposed to feel like, if you're doing it honestly instead of rushing past it the way people expect you to after enough years have gone by. I thought about that conversation often in the weeks that followed, about how a bowl of stew at a small diner on Main Street had quietly anchored a billionaire to the last good year of his marriage, and about how none of that had anything to do, really, with money at all. It was simply about a specific human hunger that money had never once been able to solve for him, the hunger to be near something that still tasted like a person he loved. I began to understand Nate over that autumn, not primarily as the extraordinarily wealthy man who had changed my family's circumstances, but as a specific, particular person carrying a specific, particular grief. And I think that understanding changed the shape of our friendship into something sturdier than gratitude alone could have built. I want to tell you about the relationship that grew, slowly and without any particular plan behind it, between Nate and Tommy that autumn, because it became one of the most unexpectedly tender parts of this whole story. Nate began visiting Harlow Springs more regularly once construction on the hub was underway, ostensibly to check on the project's progress, though I came to understand that at least some of those visits were simply him wanting an excuse to come back to a town that had, in its own way, given him something he had not expected to find again. He would stop by on a Saturday sometimes, and Tommy, who had taken to Nate immediately, and without any of the caution I might have expected from a child meeting his mother's billionaire friend, treated him almost entirely as an unusually patient old man who was willing to discuss, at genuinely exhaustive length, the relative combat merits of the Tyrannosaurus rex versus the Triceratops, a debate Tommy had apparently been running with escalating sophistication since he was 4 years old. Nate, it turned out, actually knew a fair amount about paleontology, a fact that delighted Tommy beyond almost anything else that had happened that whole year, more than the new car, more than anything. And I watched, on more than one Saturday afternoon, the two of them sitting on our living room floor with a stack of library books between them. Nate patiently explaining bite force measurements in a voice with none of the careful business formality I'd heard him use with Vivian, or in describing board politics, and I understood, watching them, that Tommy was giving Nate something just as real as whatever Nate had given us, an uncomplicated, undemanding companionship that had nothing to do with grief or money or corporate boards. Just a 7-year-old's genuine delight in an adult willing to take dinosaurs as seriously as he did. I asked Nate once, gently, whether spending time with Tommy was hard for him, given that he and Eleanor had never had children of their own, a fact he'd mentioned once in passing without much elaboration, and he thought about the question for a long moment before answering, the way he thought about most things, and said, "Maria, I won't pretend it doesn't carry its own particular ache, wondering about a life we didn't get to have, but I've found, somewhat to my own surprise, that the ache doesn't crowd out the good part. It sits right alongside it, and I would rather have both than have neither. If those are truly the only two options life offers a man in my position at this point. Around that same time, in October, a reporter from a regional business publication in Denver reached out to me directly, having pieced together enough of the public story. The board vote controversy had left a small trail in industry press that she wanted to write a feature on what she called the human interest angle behind the Harlow Springs distribution hub decision. I want to be honest that my first instinct was to refuse entirely, because by that point I had come to deeply value the relative quiet of my actual life. Tommy's school, my shifts at Sunny Bright, Sunday dinners with Denise and my mother, and the idea of that quiet becoming a magazine feature made something in me recoil immediately. I called Vivian about it, and she was, as always, careful and direct, and she said, "Maria, you have absolutely no obligation to talk to this reporter, none whatsoever. And if you want my honest opinion, there is also a version of this where declining entirely to comment invites more speculation than a brief, carefully considered statement would." I thought about it for several days and talked it over with Nate, who was characteristically clear that the decision was entirely mine to make and that he would support whatever I chose. And in the end, I agreed to a single short interview on the condition that Tommy's name never appear in print and that the piece focus on the town and the jobs rather than on the specific dollar figures of what Nate had done for my family personally. The article ran in early November, almost exactly 1 year after that night at Grady's Corner, a modest piece, more focused, to the reporter's credit, on Harlow Springs itself, the new jobs, the town's cautious optimism, than on me specifically. Though it did include one quote from me that I stand behind completely. When she asked me what I wanted people to take away from the story, I told her, "I don't want anyone reading this to think the lesson is that kindness pays out in dollars, because it usually doesn't. And if you're kind to strangers hoping for a payout, you've already missed the entire point. The lesson, if there is one, is that you get to decide who you are on an ordinary Thursday when nobody's watching and nothing is riding on it as far as you know, and once in a very great while, so rarely you should never count on it, it turns out something was riding on it after all." I want to go back for a moment to something Nate told me during that same November, almost exactly a year after Grady's Corner, because I think it belongs earlier in this story than where I actually learned it. And I have decided to tell it here instead, because this is when he finally trusted me enough to say it out loud. He told me that the 24 or so people he had tested over the preceding several years, before ever reaching Harlow Springs, had left him more discouraged than he'd let on even to Vivian, who had handled every one of those situations quietly on his behalf. Most people, once the truth came out, reacted with a scrambling, apologetic excitement that he understood completely, but that had, over enough repetitions, started to feel almost unbearable. And there had been a stretch, about 18 months before we ever met, where he had seriously considered abandoning the entire practice altogether, telling Vivian, in his own words, that he was beginning to suspect he was simply confirming his own worst assumption about people over and over rather than genuinely testing anything. He told me that the town 2 towns over from Harlow Springs, where he'd had the police called on him at a diner, had actually been his very last stop before he nearly gave the whole project up, and that he had sat in his truck in that diner's parking lot afterward, genuinely shaken, and called Vivian, and told her he thought he was done, that maybe there simply wasn't anywhere left where an ordinary stranger's decency toward another ordinary stranger still existed, the way he remembered it existing when he was young, watching his own father run that single delivery truck out of a garage in Pueblo, helping other struggling drivers with cash from his own pocket more times than young Nate had ever fully understood at the time. Vivian, he said, had talked him into one more town before he gave up entirely, mostly because the highway infrastructure data made Harlow Springs too promising a site to skip purely on his own discouragement. And that was how he ended up, reluctantly, driving that old green pickup truck up Route 40 on a bitterly cold November night, half expecting one more disappointment before he let the whole idea go. I asked him, when he told me all this, whether he'd known, in the moment, standing at that gas pump with his pockets empty, that something different was happening, and he shook his head and said, "No, Maria, honestly, no. I want to be truthful with you rather than dramatic. I did not have some instant certainty the moment you walked over. What I had was a woman who gave me $20 without hesitating and refused to let me call it a debt. And it was only afterward, driving home that night in the tow truck cab with Dale, turning the whole encounter over in my mind, that I understood how completely unusual that had actually been. Actually, it took me most of that winter, watching from a distance, having Vivian quietly confirm a few details about your life without ever approaching you directly, to become certain enough to come back in April and actually tell you the truth. That admission that he had nearly given up entirely, that Harlow Springs and I had very nearly not happened at all, sat with me for a long time afterward, because it reframed something about the whole story for me. I had spent a year thinking of myself as someone who had simply passed a test without knowing she was being tested. But hearing Nate describe how close the entire project had come to ending before it ever reached Route 40 made me understand it differently. Less like a test I happened to pass, and more like a lit match someone had been carrying a long way through the wind, cupped carefully in two hands, hoping against real doubt that it would still be burning by the time it found something worth lighting. I want to tell you about the specific people in Harlow Springs whose lives changed once the distribution hub actually began hiring, because I think the real measure of what happened that year is not really about me at all. It is about them, and I have made a point of paying close attention to it precisely because I never want to lose sight of the fact that the biggest and most lasting good that came out of that November night had almost nothing to do with my own family's circumstances. Marcus Anaya, a young man of 22 who had been working part-time at Grady's Corner pumping gas and doing small mechanical repairs since he graduated high school, unable to afford the trade school certification he actually wanted, was among the first 100 people hired at the hub in a logistics technician training program that Calloway Freight funded directly. And he told me once, stopping by the daycare to pick up his younger sister, that it was the first job he'd ever had with actual benefits attached to it. Health insurance, a retirement match, things he said he genuinely never expected to have access to before he turned 30, if ever. Ferris Dunbar, an older man who had worked the same shift at the hardware store as my own mother for years before it nearly closed twice in one decade, watched his granddaughter, a young woman named Bethany, who had moved to Denver for lack of local opportunity, actually moved back to Harlow Springs that winter to take a position in the hub's growing administrative office. And Ferris told me, with a kind of quiet wonder that I found more moving than almost anything else that whole year, that he had genuinely believed, right up until she moved back, that he would spend his last years watching his grandchildren scatter to wherever the jobs were, the way so many small-town grandparents watch their families disperse, and instead she was 15 minutes away again, showing up for Sunday dinners same as the rest of us. My mother, watching all of this unfold from her seat at those same Sunday dinners, said to me once, late that winter, "Maria, I want you to understand something, and I want you to really hear it, not just nod along. What happened to you is a strange, wonderful, once-in-a-lifetime thing, and I am grateful for it every single day, but what happened to this town, the actual jobs, the actual families staying together instead of scattering to Denver or Cheyenne or wherever else, that part isn't really about luck at all. That part is about a man who decided to actually look at a place properly before deciding what it was worth. And that's a decision more people in his position could make if they were willing to, and I think that matters more than the specific fact that it happened to land on you." I thought about my mother's words often that winter, the first anniversary of that night at Grady's Corner approaching quietly in the background of an ordinary, busy life. Tommy, now 8 years old and deep into a new obsession with the solar system that had, mercifully for Nate, at least partially displaced the dinosaur debates, though Nate assured Tommy solemnly that Triceratops still had, in his professional assessment, a fighting chance in most scenarios. I had, by that point, made my own decision about work, one I had turned over carefully for months rather than rushing into. And I want to explain it honestly because I think it says something true about what actually mattered to me once the financial pressure lifted. I did not quit Sunny Bright Daycare. I cut back my hours somewhat, from 32 a week to about 20, using the additional flexibility to spend more time with Tommy and to finally take 2 community college courses toward the early childhood education degree I had wanted, quietly, for years, without ever having the time or the tuition money to pursue it. I stopped the overnight cleaning shifts entirely, the very first change I made once the personal fund cleared, because those had never been work I loved. They had only ever been work I needed, and there is a difference, I've learned, between generosity that frees you to stop doing something you never wanted to do in the first place, and generosity that tries to talk you out of the things you actually love. I finished my associate's degree in early childhood education the following spring. A year and a half after that night at the gas pump, and Sunnybright's owner, a kind, weary woman named Deb Halverson, who had run that daycare for over 2 decades, offered me a lead teacher position the same week I graduated, a position I would have had no realistic path toward before, not for lack of ability, but for lack of the specific credential the state required. And I took it, and I want to tell you that walking into that classroom on my first day as lead teacher, in a wing of the building we'd actually managed to expand thanks in part to a modest facilities donation Nate had made quietly, without ever putting his name on anything, felt like a bigger, more personally meaningful milestone to me than any of the numbers in Vivian's trust documents ever had. I want to tell you about the exact 1-year anniversary of that night at Grady's Corner, because something happened that evening that I have thought about more than almost any other single moment in this entire story. It fell on a Thursday again that year, the calendar simply lining back up that way, and I found myself, without entirely planning it, driving out to Grady's Corner in the early evening for gas on my way home from a late meeting at the daycare, the same pump, the same buzzing overhead lights, though the night itself was milder than the bitter cold of a year before. Grady was behind the counter when I went in to grab a coffee, and he said, "You know what today is, Maria?" And I said I did, and he came around the counter and gave me a hug, which Grady is not by nature a hugging kind of man. And he said, "This whole town owes you something. It can't ever really pay back properly." And I told him, the way I've told a lot of people this same year, that I didn't do anything except hand a stranger $20 on a cold night, anyone would have done the same. And Grady shook his head slowly and said, "Maria, I've owned this station 18 years. I've watched a lot of people walk through that door in a lot of kinds of trouble. And I can tell you for a fact that not everyone would have done what you did, not even close to everyone. And I think it's important you eventually let yourself believe that." Standing in that parking lot afterward, coffee warming my hands, I thought about the specific version of myself who had stood in that exact spot a year earlier. $23 to her name, a sleeping son in the back seat, no idea that anything about her ordinary tired Thursday was about to become extraordinary. I did not feel, standing there a year later, like a fundamentally different person, and I want to be honest that this surprised me. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I think I had expected the money and the trust funds and the newspaper article to have transformed something essential about who I was. And instead, what I actually felt was simply more myself than I had been able to afford to be for years. The version of Maria who had time to help her son with solar system homework instead of falling asleep at the kitchen table. The version who could sit with her sister on a Sunday evening without the specific exhaustion of 2 jobs sitting underneath every conversation. Nate called that same evening, as it happened, from somewhere in the middle of a business trip through one of his company's other regional hubs. And he said, "I wanted to call today specifically, Maria, because I think anniversaries like this one deserve to be marked properly rather than let slide past unnoticed." And I told him about standing in the Grady's Corner parking lot with my coffee, and he was quiet for a moment. And then he said something I have carried with me since. He said, "I think about that night constantly, Maria, more than you'd probably guess given how much of my time gets consumed by considerably larger and more complicated things now. I think about how close I came to giving up the whole search before I ever drove up that particular stretch of road. And I think about how strange it is that the entire shape of the last year, for both of us, for your whole town actually, came down to something as small and as unremarkable as which pump you happened to choose that night, and whether you happened to glance over at a stranger patting his own pockets instead of looking away the way it would have been so easy to do. I need to tell you about one more difficult thing that happened that first year, because I promised myself when I started telling this story that I would not smooth over the hard parts simply because the ending is a happy one, and this particular hard part involved Tommy's father, Curtis, in a way I did not see coming at all. Curtis had, as I mentioned, been mostly absent from Tommy's life for years, 4 birthday cards and no reliable support in 7 years. And I want to be honest that once the newspaper article ran, brief and careful as it was about not naming Tommy directly, enough people in Curtis's own circle apparently pieced together who the story was actually about, and he reached out to me directly for the first time in nearly 2 years, in December, by text message, saying he'd heard about our good fortune and thought, given everything, it was probably time we discussed things being different for Tommy going forward, meaning, though he did not say it outright at first, that he wanted a relationship with his son again, and separately, in a follow-up message 2 days later, when I hadn't yet responded to the first, that he'd also fallen behind on some bills and wondered if I might be able to help him out, given how things had changed for me. I sat with those messages for several days before responding, and I called Vivian, not because I needed her legal advice exactly, this wasn't a trust matter, but because by then she had become something closer to a trusted advisor across all of it. And she listened and then said, "Maria, this is entirely a parenting decision, not a legal one, and only you can weigh whether Curtis reaching out now is genuine or whether it's convenient timing. But I will say, having seen a version of this pattern before in other circumstances, that those 2 messages arriving 2 days apart, the fatherhood question first and the money question second, is worth paying close attention to. I thought about it carefully and talked it over at length with my mother, and surprisingly to me, with Denise, whose own experience with an unreliable co-parent after her divorce gave her a perspective I found genuinely useful rather than simply well-meaning. In the end, I wrote back to Curtis honestly. I told him that Tommy would always, without any condition attached whatsoever, be welcome to know his father if Curtis wanted to actually show up consistently and do the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding a relationship a 7-year-old could trust, starting with regular phone calls and visits on a schedule Tommy could count on, with no connection whatsoever to any financial request, which I told him plainly I would not be entertaining. Separate the 2 things completely, or I could not engage with either one honestly. Curtis did not respond to that message, and has not, as of this telling, made any further contact, and I want to be honest about how that made me feel, which was sad for Tommy's sake, genuinely sad, but not remotely surprised, and I have made my peace with the fact that some doors people themselves choose not to walk back through, no matter how wide you leave them open. I mention this not because it resolved neatly, it didn't. It's simply a true, unglamorous piece of what that first year actually contained, alongside all the good. And I think leaving it out would make this story feel tidier than real life ever actually is. Windfalls do not undo the parts of your history that were already complicated before the windfall arrived. They just place those complicated parts under a slightly different, sometimes harsher light. The second year of knowing Nate brought its own difficulties, though of a much different, and in the end, much more frightening kind than anything Roy Pruitt or Preston Whitlock had managed. In February, about 16 months after that night at Grady's Corner, Nate suffered a heart attack, a moderate one, caught early enough by a routine physical his own doctor insisted on more forcefully than usual, and he was hospitalized in Denver for 8 days. And I want to be honest about how strange it felt to receive that news, a phone call from Vivian rather than from Nate himself, because he had been too weak in the first 2 days to make calls, and to realize how completely my feelings for him had shifted over 16 months, from gratitude toward a benefactor into something closer to the specific, worried love you feel for an actual family member. I drove to Denver the day after Vivian's call, leaving Tommy with my mother, and I sat in a hospital waiting room for most of an afternoon before a nurse let me in to see him. And I want to describe what I felt walking into that room, seeing Nate smaller and grayer against hospital pillows than I had ever once seen him, even at his most worn down that first November at the gas pump. He opened his eyes and saw me, and the first thing he said, in a voice considerably weaker than his usual clear, businesslike tone, was, "Maria, you didn't need to drive all this way." And I said, "Nate, of course I did." And he was quiet for a moment. And then he said something that I have thought about often since. He said, in $4 billion worth of relationships, business partners, board members, people who call themselves close friends at every gala I've ever attended, you are one of perhaps 4 people who actually came. And I want you to know I noticed that, and I will not forget it. His recovery took the better part of 2 months, and I visited 3 more times during that stretch, twice bringing Tommy, who drew Nate a series of increasingly elaborate get-well cards featuring dinosaurs performing what Tommy assured everyone were medically accurate first aid procedures on each other. Cards that Nate told me, later, he kept in a drawer in his actual home office rather than at Calloway Freight headquarters. Alongside, he admitted a little sheepishly, almost nothing else personal at all in that particular drawer. It was during that recovery, in a quiet conversation at his home outside Denver on one of my visits, that Nate told me he had made a decision about his own estate planning that he wanted me to understand before it became a matter of formal paperwork. He told me he intended to establish a permanent charitable foundation, funded substantially from his own personal holdings rather than from Calloway Freight itself, focused specifically on small towns like Harlow Springs, communities on the edge of being forgotten by exactly the kind of large-scale investment decisions companies like his made every year, and that he wanted me, if I was willing, to sit on the foundation's small founding board, not as a figurehead, he was careful to specify, but as someone who understood, from lived experience, rather than from a consultant's report, what that kind of investment actually meant on the ground in a town like ours. I told him I didn't have any background in running a foundation, and he said gently, "Maria, I didn't have any background running a trucking company either. When my father handed me that one truck in Pueblo, background is simply a word for things you learn by doing them, if you're willing to do the learning. And I want people like you in that room specifically because the people who usually end up in rooms like that already know how to sound confident without necessarily knowing what a town like Harlow Springs actually needs." I said yes, eventually, after thinking about it for several weeks and talking it through with my mother, with Denise, and with Deb Halverson at the daycare, all of whom, in their own ways, told me some version of the same thing, that I had spent my whole life understanding exactly the kind of place and the kind of people this foundation was meant to serve, and that understanding was worth more in that boardroom than any degree I didn't have. The foundation launched formally that autumn, named, over my own repeated and genuinely uncomfortable objections, the Calloway Delgado Community Trust, a naming decision Nate insisted on despite my telling him more than once that I had done nothing to deserve my name on anything, and his response, every time I raised it, was the same, that the entire foundation existed specifically because of a principle I had demonstrated without ever intending to demonstrate a principle at all, and that erasing my name from it in the interest of my own modesty would, in his words, actually misrepresent what the foundation was for. I gave in eventually, though I still feel a small flush of embarrassment every time I see it printed on official letterhead. Our first major grant, decided after months of the kind of careful site evaluation Nate insisted on bringing from his own corporate discipline, went to a town called Prairie Bend, about 4 hours northeast of Harlow Springs, on the Eastern Plains, a farming community of just under 2,000 people that had lost its only grocery store the previous year, forcing residents, many of them elderly, to drive nearly 40 minutes for basic groceries. The foundation funded a community-owned grocery cooperative there, structured so that profits stayed within the town rather than flowing out to a distant corporate owner, and I flew out with Nate for the ribbon cutting, my first time on a private plane, an experience I found almost comically disorienting, given that 18 months earlier I had been calculating whether I could afford new brakes. I met the woman most responsible for organizing Prairie Bend's grocery cooperative effort, a retired schoolteacher named Constance Ruiz, who had spent nearly 2 years petitioning every source of funding she could find before the foundation's grant finally came through, and she told me, standing in the half-finished cooperative building, smelling of fresh paint and new shelving, that she had genuinely begun to believe nobody with real resources was ever going to look twice at a town the size of Prairie Bend, that towns like ours simply fell below whatever threshold made a place worth a large institution's attention. I told her, honestly, that 18 months earlier I would have said exactly the same thing about Harlow Springs, and that I understood, in a way I don't think I could have understood before any of this happened to me, exactly how it felt to watch your own town slowly become invisible to the kinds of decisions that shape which places get to have a future and which places simply get left to shrink. That trip to Prairie Bend, more than almost anything else that happened in those 2 years, clarified something for me about why I had said yes to the foundation board in the first place. Beyond simple loyalty to Nate, I realized, standing in that half-painted grocery cooperative, that the specific shape of luck that had found me at Grady's Corner, a stranger's need intersecting with my own instinct to help without calculation, was not something that could be scaled up or replicated on purpose. Not really. You cannot institutionalize an accident of decency the way you institutionalize a grant program. But what you can do, I realized, is take the resources that accident happened to unlock and go looking, deliberately this time, for the Prairie Bends of the world, the towns nobody with real money is looking at, and try to be, on purpose, the kind of attention that Grady's Corner had given me by pure chance. I want to tell you about one more difficult stretch, because I promised at the start of this story that I would not smooth over the hard parts, and this one came from a direction that genuinely surprised me. In the foundation's second year, Preston Whitlock, the same board member who had tried to reopen the Harlow Springs site decision, resigned from the Calloway Freight Board under circumstances that were never fully made public, but that Vivian later explained to me, carefully and only after confirming I actually wanted to know the details, involved an unrelated internal audit that had uncovered Whitlock steering a separate vendor contract toward a company his own brother-in-law partially owned, an entirely different kind of conflict of interest than the one he had tried to accuse Nate of, and one considerably less defensible. I want to be honest that I felt something complicated when I learned this. Not quite satisfaction. Satisfaction feels too small and too petty a word for what it actually was. It was closer to a kind of sad recognition, the specific sadness of watching a pattern repeat itself. A man who had spent considerable energy accusing someone else of allowing personal relationships to corrupt a business decision, turning out to have been doing exactly that himself, quietly, the whole time, in a much less examined corner of the same company. Nate, when I asked him about it, said only, "Maria, I take no pleasure in it, genuinely none. Preston Whitlock built real value for this company across a long career before he let something smaller than his own reputation get the better of him. And I think that's a more common story than any of us like to admit in boardrooms and gas station parking lots alike." Denise, hearing about all of this over one of our Sunday dinners, said something I've thought about since, in her own dry, practical way that I had genuinely come to miss during the years we weren't close. She said, "You know what's funny, Maria? Everybody who tried to take advantage of any part of this, Roy Pruitt, that Whitlock man, they all thought they were the clever ones, working some angle nobody else could see. And it turned out the actual clever move, the whole time, was just being straightforwardly honest with people and hoping they'd be honest back. Took me getting swindled out of $18,000 to actually learn that lesson myself, but I got there eventually." And I said, "We both got there, Denise, in our own ways." And she reached over and squeezed my hand across my mother's kitchen table, a gesture that would have felt completely unimaginable between the two of us 3 years earlier. Denise, incidentally, went back to school herself the following year, a decision I know she credits partly to watching me finish my own degree, earning a certification in financial counseling specifically so that she could work part-time alongside her insurance job, helping other families in Grand County navigate exactly the kind of predatory financial advice that had nearly cost her everything. And she told me once, only half joking, that she'd become the person she desperately wished had existed to warn her about Roy Pruitt before he ever showed up on my front step. And I told her that was, without question, the best possible use anyone could make of a genuinely terrible experience. I want to move forward now a little more quickly through the years that followed, because I think the specific texture of ordinary life mattering more than any single dramatic event is itself part of what I want this story to say. Tommy turned 10 this spring. The Harlow Springs Hub celebrated its 3rd anniversary of operation, employing by then just over 400 people directly, a number that had grown past even Nate's original projections as a second phase of the facility broke ground to handle expanded regional demand. Curtis never did reach back out again, and I want to be honest that some years that absence still catches Tommy at unexpected moments. A Father's Day school project, a passing comment from a classmate. But he has, increasingly as he's gotten older, folded Nate into his understanding of the adult men who show up consistently in his life, alongside his grandfather's memory and the handful of uncle figures he's picked up among my own old friends around town. And I have stopped correcting him when he occasionally, without any confusion about the actual facts of his parentage, refers to Nate simply as Grandpa Nate in conversation with his own friends. Nate, for his part, never once asked to be called that, and I remember the first time Tommy used it at around age 9, in the parking lot after a school science fair where Nate had, at Tommy's specific and insistent invitation, judged the elementary division as a favor to the school. Nate went completely still for a moment, the way I imagine a man does when something lands somewhere he genuinely was not braced for. And then he said quietly, to me, rather than to Tommy, who was already running ahead toward the car, I did not expect that, Maria. I want you to know I did not expect that at all. And I told him, Nate, I think you've earned it same as anyone earns that title. Slowly, by simply always showing up. And he was quiet for a long moment before he said, then I intend to keep earning it for as long as he'll let me. By the time Tommy turned 12, Harlow Springs itself had changed in ways that would have seemed impossible, standing at that gas pump 6 years earlier. The elementary school, which had been on a slow trajectory toward consolidation with a neighboring district for over a decade before the hub opened, instead saw enrollment stabilize and then grow slightly as families moved to town for hub jobs. Enough growth that the district broke ground on an addition to the building rather than discussing closure. The hardware store that had barely hung on for years found itself with enough new local customers, hub employees buying homes and doing their own renovations, that it actually expanded its hours for the first time in a decade. Grady's Corner itself added a second bay for repairs and hired 2 more mechanics, Marcus Anaya, the young man who'd gotten his start there before moving to the hub's technician program, occasionally coming back to help train new hires on weekends, a small full-circle detail that Grady mentions with visible pride every single time it comes up. I finished my bachelor's degree in early childhood education when Tommy was 11, taking evening classes at a satellite campus that opened in a neighboring town partly because of the region's growing population. And Deb Halverson, nearing retirement herself by then, asked me gently over coffee one Sunday afternoon at her own kitchen table whether I had ever considered simply buying Sunny Bright Daycare outright when she finally stepped back, rather than watching it get sold to some chain operator with no particular investment in Harlow Springs specifically. I want to tell you honestly that 6 years earlier, I would have laughed at the idea of owning anything beyond the contents of my own rental house. And instead, I said yes almost immediately, and worked out the purchase with Deb over the following year, using savings from my own trust fund rather than any direct gift from Nate, a distinction that mattered enormously to me, because I wanted this particular thing, unlike so much else in my life by that point, to be something I had built with my own accumulated effort rather than something handed to me. I took ownership of Sunny Bright Daycare the same month Tommy turned 12, renaming it after a great deal of deliberation and several rejected ideas, Tommy contributed that involved dinosaurs in ways that would have confused prospective parents considerably. Simply Sunny Bright Early Learning Center, keeping the name Deb had built for over 2 decades rather than erasing it for the sake of a fresh start. Because I understood, by then, exactly how much that continuity mattered to families who had trusted the place with their own children for years. I expanded the infant care program that same year, something Deb had wanted to do for a decade but never had the capital to pursue, and hired 3 additional staff, including, in a detail that still makes me smile every time I think about it, Denise's younger teenager, my niece Paige, who took an after-school position helping in the toddler room while finishing her last year of high school, deciding, somewhat to Denise's surprise and considerable delight, that she wanted to pursue early childhood education herself in college the following year. I want to tell you about a conversation Nate and I had around that time on the back porch of his home outside Denver on a warm evening, watching Tommy and 2 of Nate's actual grandnieces, children of his late sister's family who visited more regularly once Nate's health scare had made him more deliberate about the relationships he prioritized, chase fireflies across the lawn in the specific chaotic joy of children who have been allowed to stay up slightly past their bedtime. Nate said, unprompted, watching them, "Maria, I want to tell you something I don't think I've said plainly enough. The $4.3 billion the company, all 40 years of building it, I am proud of that work genuinely. But if you had told the version of me sitting at that gas pump, patting down empty pockets, testing strangers out of a grief I could barely name to myself, that within a handful of years I would be sitting on this porch with people I actually consider family, watching children who aren't related to me by blood but who call me Grandpa Nate without a second thought, I would not have believed it was possible for that specific kind of good fortune to still be available to a man in my position at my age. I want you to know that you didn't just find me a good town for a distribution hub. You found me my way back into an actual life. And Eleanor, if she's watching any of this from wherever she is, I think she would tell you that mattered more to her than any of it ever mattered to me." I did not have a tidy response to that, and I don't think one was needed. I simply sat with him on that porch in a comfortable silence that would have been unimaginable between a waitress-adjacent stranger and a billionaire 6 years earlier, and watched the fireflies, and thought about how far both of our lives had traveled from 2 separate, entirely ordinary starting points. A struggling single mother doing math at a kitchen table, and a grieving widower testing strangers at gas stations towards something neither of us could have designed or predicted. Built instead out of 100 small decisions, mine to give $20 without hesitation, his to keep testing one more town before he gave up entirely, that had nothing dramatic about them individually and everything to do with who each of us had quietly decided to be. I want to tell you about something that happened just this past winter, because I think it belongs near the very end of this story. Even though it happened years after everything else I've described, I had stopped at Grady's Corner on an ordinary Thursday evening, picking up gas on my way home from the daycare, now my daycare, a fact that still occasionally surprises me when I catch myself thinking it plainly, and a young woman was standing at the next pump over, maybe 22 or 23, with an infant carrier buckled into the back seat of an old sedan with a check engine light glowing steadily on the dashboard, and she was on the phone, and I could hear enough of her side of the conversation to understand that her card had just been declined at the pump, and that whoever she was talking to on the phone was not going to be able to help her that night. She hung up and stood there for a moment with the particular stillness of someone doing quiet, frightened math, and I want to be honest that I recognized that stillness immediately because I had stood in that exact spot myself, in that exact posture, with my own son asleep in a car behind me, years before this young woman was likely old enough to remember much of anything. I walked over and I said, "Excuse me." I couldn't help but notice, "Is everything all right?" The exact words, it occurred to me only afterward, that I had once said to Nate at that very same pump, and she looked embarrassed and said something about her card getting declined and needing to figure out how to get home, and I did not hesitate. The way I imagine Nate did not fully understand, in the moment, why he was testing anyone at all. I simply took out my own card and told the attendant to put $50 on her pump. And I told her, "Don't worry about paying it back. That's not how this works." And her eyes filled up in a way that told me exactly how frightened she'd actually been standing there. She asked my name and I told her, Maria, and she said hers was Kayla, and thanked me 3 separate times before she drove off. And I stood there afterward in the same spot where a stranger in a worn canvas coat had once stood testing an entire town without any of us knowing it. And I thought about how strange and how simple the whole shape of this story actually is, when you get all the way down to it. It is not really about billionaires or trusts or distribution hubs, or even about the specific $20 that started it. It is about the fact that every single one of us, on some ordinary Thursday, gets a chance to be the person who notices someone else's quiet, frightened math and decides to interrupt it without knowing and without needing to know whether anything will ever come back to us for doing it. I don't know what became of Kayla after that night, whether she was simply a young mother having a hard month, or whether, somewhere down the road, she'll turn out to matter to some larger story the way I turned out to matter to Nate's. And I want to be completely honest that it does not matter to me even slightly which one is true, because I understood, driving home that night, that the actual lesson of everything that happened to my family was never really about Nate Calloway specifically. It was about the fact that you get to decide, every single day in small unwitnessed moments, at a gas pump or a kitchen table or a daycare classroom, who you are going to be when nobody is keeping score, and that once in a very great while, so rarely that you should never count on it or wait around hoping for it. It turns out the universe was keeping score after all. But the deciding has to come first, entirely on its own, without any hope of the score attached, or none of it means what it's supposed to mean. I think often, these days, about my own mother and about that foil-wrapped plate of pot roast she sent home with a struggling neighbor when I was 9 years old, a memory I did not fully understand until I was an adult, doing my own kitchen table math, on nights when the gas bill climbed higher than the paycheck could comfortably cover. I asked my mother once, fairly recently, whether she ever imagined on those hard weeks when my father's paycheck didn't quite stretch far enough, that something like what happened to me was even possible, some enormous life-altering reward waiting somewhere down the road for the specific kind of person she was raising me to be. And my mother laughed, an actual real laugh, and said, "Maria, honey, no, absolutely not. And if I had been kind to people hoping for something like this to happen, it never would have worked, because people can always tell, somehow, when kindness has a hook in it. I was kind because that's the family I wanted us to be, full stop. And everything that happened to you afterward is a wonderful, strange, once-in-a-lifetime accident layered on top of that. Not the reason for it, and I want you to make very sure your own son understands the difference, because I think that difference is the whole entire point. I have tried, in the years since, to make sure Tommy understands exactly that distinction, and I think watching him grow into the specific kind of 12-year-old he's become, unusually attentive to smaller kids struggling at his school, the first to notice when a classmate is sitting alone at lunch that some version of the lesson has actually taken hold in him, not because he watched his mother receive a fortune from a stranger, but because he has watched her in the years since continue quietly doing small, ordinary kindnesses that have nothing to do with that fortune at all. Covering a young mother's gas on a cold Thursday, keeping tuition manageable for families at Sunny Bright who are struggling the way I once struggled, sitting with Ferris Dunbar's widow every week after he passed 2 years ago, simply because someone should, not because anyone was measuring it. Nate is 72 now, still chairman of Calloway Freight, though he has handed most of the daily operations to a president he trusts completely, and he still comes to Harlow Springs several times a year, not incognito anymore. Everyone in town knows exactly who he is these days, but he still, without fail, orders the beef stew at the Alpine Kettle on Tuesdays when he's in town. And Peggy Lukes, the owner, still makes it from her grandmother's recipe, and still refuses, every single time, to let him pay for it. A small joke between the two of them by now. Nate trying to leave money on the table, and Peggy sliding it back across to him with the exact same practiced firmness I once used at a gas pump on a cold November night. He told me once that he thinks Eleanor would have loved Harlow Springs, would have loved Peggy's stew, and Grady's gruff kindness, and the specific unhurried texture of a town that never learned to rush anything, and that some part of him has come to think of this whole valley as the place he finally, after 6 years of grief, wandering through other people's kitchens, looking for a taste he couldn't name, found something close enough to home to stay. I want to tell you about one last conversation because I think it belongs here, near the end, more than anywhere earlier I could have placed it chronologically. It happened this past spring, almost exactly 6 years after that first night at Grady's Corner, on a Sunday afternoon at my mother's kitchen table, where Nate had, by then, become enough of a fixture at our family gatherings that nobody thought twice about setting an extra place for him. Tommy had gone outside with Paige to toss a football in the yard. Denise and my mother were doing dishes, and Nate and I sat alone at the table for a few minutes with our coffee, and he asked me, out of nowhere, whether I ever resented how long it had taken him to tell me the truth, whether some part of me wished he had simply told me who he was the very first time he sat down in booth 6, or in this case, the very first time his truck happened to break down anywhere near me. I told him honestly that I had thought about that question many times over the years, and that the answer, every single time I turned it over, came out the same, which was no, and I explained why, because I think the reason matters more than the answer itself. If he had told me in year 1, or even in the first few months, I don't think I could have promised him, or myself, that I would have kept doing exactly what I did with exactly the same unthinking ease. Because once you know there's a fortune somewhere behind a kindness, even a kindness you're extending to someone else entirely, some part of you starts performing for it, however much you don't want to, and however hard you try not to. The months of not knowing weren't a delay before the real story started. They were the real story. They were the only way any of it could have meant what it turned out to mean, to either of us. Nate was quiet for a long moment after I said that, turning his coffee cup slowly on my mother's kitchen table the same unhurried way he used to turn it on the formica at the Alpine kettle. And then he said, "Maria, I think about all the money differently because of you. And I want to try to explain what I mean, because I don't think I've ever said this out loud to anyone, not even Vivian. For most of my life, money was the thing that told me whether I could trust somebody, if that makes any sense at all, not directly. Nobody ever says it that plainly, but underneath every relationship I built after a certain amount of success, there was always this quiet, humming question: does this person actually want to know me, or do they want to know what I can do for them? And you were the first person in longer than I can comfortably admit who had absolutely no idea there was anything to want. And it turned out, watching you, that the entire time I thought money was the thing keeping me from trusting people. The actual problem was that I had stopped believing untested kindness could exist at all. You didn't just restore my faith in strangers, Maria. You reminded me it was possible to be tested honestly instead of already knowing the answer to the test before you administer it. And I don't think there's a version of my life, however much money is attached to it, that gets to feel meaningful again without having relearned that first. I told him, and I meant this completely, that I thought the version of him sitting at my mother's kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, patient enough to let two 12-year-olds argue about football strategy in the next room while his coffee went lukewarm, was a considerably better use of $4 billion than anything printed in the business magazine article that first showed me his face, and he laughed at that. A real laugh. The same one I first heard the day he showed me his photograph at the picnic table outside Sunny Bright and said, "Maria, I would very much like to believe you're right about that." And I think, 6 years into knowing you, I finally do. I want to close this story by telling you, plainly and in order, what became of everyone in it. Because I think people who listen to stories like this one deserve to know that the good parts held, that this was not a single bright afternoon followed by a slow fade back into difficulty, but an actual ongoing life that has kept unfolding, mostly well, in the years since. My mother, now 69, still lives in the same small blue house on Larkspur Street, though we finally convinced her to let the foundation quietly cover a new roof and updated plumbing 2 winters ago, an offer she resisted for months before finally accepting, muttering the whole time that she had lived 70 years without needing charity and didn't see why she should start now, until my own mother, in a rare moment of being outmaneuvered by her own daughter, admitted that watching her grandson grow up in a house with reliable heat mattered more to her than her pride did. Denise, 41 now, still works part-time at the insurance office in Granby and part-time as a financial counselor specializing in elder and family financial exploitation, work she has told me she finds more meaningful than anything she's done in her career. Precisely because she understands from the inside exactly what it costs a family when someone like Roy Pruitt gets his hooks into them. Roy Pruitt himself, incidentally, was eventually convicted on multiple counts of fraud in a separate case out of Boulder County. The widow whose wrongful death settlement he'd targeted testified at length, and he is currently serving a sentence that Vivian assures me is considerably longer than the wrist slaps he'd previously managed to avoid across 2 other states. Grady still runs Grady's Corner. Now with 2 full bays and 4 employees instead of the skeleton crew he managed alone for years, and he still keeps the coffee decent. And he still, every single November, on the anniversary of that night, leaves a folded $20 bill in an envelope taped to pump 3 with no name on it, for whoever happens to need it that particular week. A small private tradition he started the 2nd year and has kept faithfully ever since, telling me once that he figures the universe ought to have more than one working example of exactly how this thing is supposed to go. Marcus Anaya, the young mechanic turned logistics technician, was promoted to a shift supervisor role at the hub the year he turned 26, and he still stops by Grady's Corner on weekends to help train new hires, closing a small, quiet loop that Grady mentions with visible, uncomplicated pride every time it comes up. Ferris Dunbar passed 2 winters ago, peacefully, in his sleep, at the age of 81, and his granddaughter Bethany, who moved back to Harlow Springs for the hub job that let her stay close to him in his last years, still works there today and still comes to Sunday dinner at my mother's table some weeks, having become, in the specific way small towns absorb people into their extended fabric, something close to family to all of us. Vivian Marsh still serves as legal counsel to both Nate personally and to the Calloway Delgado Community Trust, and she has become, over the years, someone I would now call a genuine friend rather than simply a lawyer I once needed. The kind of friend who still, every single year around the anniversary of that first meeting in her temporary Denver office, sends me a short note that says only, "Still protecting the structure, Maria," exactly as we built it. A small private joke between the 2 of us about the promise she extracted from me that first day of signing. The Calloway Delgado Community Trust has by now funded projects in 11 small towns across 4 states, always the same careful, unhurried process Nate insisted on from the very beginning. Real site visits, real conversations with the people who actually live in a place, not just a spreadsheet evaluation from a regional office somewhere. Constance Ruiz, from Prairie Bend, now sits on the Foundation's advisory board herself, representing exactly the kind of lived, ground-level perspective Nate had originally recruited me to bring. And she jokes at every meeting that between the 2 of us we've turned a foundation board into something that looks suspiciously like 2 grandmothers comparing notes on which towns need groceries and which ones need a school roof fixed first. And Nate, at every one of those meetings, tells her that's precisely the point, and that he's stopped attending certain planning sessions specifically because he trusts the 2 of us to identify what matters faster than any consultant his old company ever hired could manage. I think, some nights, about how strange it is that a single act, $20 folded small and pressed into a stranger's glove on a cold November night, could unfold into 11 towns and 400 jobs, and a young mother named Kayla driving home safely on a Thursday because a woman she'd never met before recognized her own frightened stillness reflected back at a gas pump. I don't say that to suggest the math works out reliably. $20 in, 11 towns out because I don't believe it does. not for anyone else who tries this expecting the same return. I say it because I think it's important for anyone listening to understand that kindness, the honest, unhedged, no strings kind, has a way of traveling much further than the person offering it can ever actually see or predict, whether or not it ever comes back around to them personally in any recognizable form at all. I still work the occasional Saturday morning shift at Sunny Bright myself, even now that I own the place outright and could easily hand every classroom over to my staff and simply manage the business side of things from an office, because Deb Halverson told me once, years ago, before she retired for good, that the day I stopped wanting to actually sit on the floor with the 4-year-olds and their crayons was the day I should sell the place to somebody who still did, and I have never once forgotten that advice. There's a particular 4-year-old in my classroom this year, a serious little girl named Ruthie, who reminds me, in ways I can't fully explain, of exactly the kind of quiet, watchful child I imagine I was myself at that age. And last month, unprompted, she gave half of her snack to a classmate who'd forgotten his lunch at home, without any fuss, without telling a teacher first to make sure it was allowed, simply handing over half a sandwich because another child needed it and she had enough. I watched her do it from across the room, and I had to look away for a moment and compose myself, because I recognized, completely, exactly what I was witnessing. A 4-year-old girl in Harlow Springs, Colorado, deciding on an entirely ordinary Tuesday that nobody else in that room would ever remember exactly what kind of person she was going to be. Nobody was testing her. Nobody was keeping score. She simply had enough, and she gave some of it away, and I think that, more than anything else in this entire story, the $1 billion, the trust funds, the distribution hub, the foundation, is the truest and most important thing I have to tell you. That is the whole of it, from a rainy, freezing Thursday at a gas pump on Route 40 to a sandwich shared quietly in a sunlit classroom 6 years later. 2 separate acts of the exact same ordinary decency, decades and dollar signs apart, proving the same simple thing all over again. I used to think, before any of this happened to me, that stories like mine belong to other people, the kind of thing you read about and admire from a safe distance, without ever imagining it could actually reach into your own ordinary week and rearrange it completely. I know better now. I know that the woman standing at Pump 1 with $23 to her name and a sleeping son in the back seat was never waiting for a story to happen to her. She was just trying to get to her next shift on time, same as always, same as every other tired working parent doing the exact same quiet, unglamorous math in the exact same kind of gas station parking lot, somewhere in this country tonight, right now, while you listen to this. I think about her sometimes, that specific ordinary version of myself, and I am endlessly grateful that she didn't know, standing there in the cold, just how much was actually riding on the next 30 seconds of her life, because I don't think she could have acted so simply and so completely without a second thought if she had known even a fraction of it. She just saw an old man in trouble, and she did what her mother raised her to do, and that, in the end, turned out to be the only thing that ever really mattered. And Tommy, 12 years old now, deep into an obsession with astronomy that has, at least for the moment, fully retired the dinosaur debates, though Nate maintains, whenever the subject resurfaces, that Triceratops still deserves more institutional respect than the current scientific consensus affords it, wants, as of this telling, to be an aerospace engineer, a goal that the Education Trust Nate established that first spring will fund completely, all the way through graduate school, if that's still what he wants by then. Though I want to be honest that what matters most to me, watching him grow, is not the specific career he lands on, but the fact that he has grown into a boy who notices the kid sitting alone at lunch, who asks the new families at Sunny Bright if they need anything before anyone else thinks to ask, who has, in other words, absorbed the actual lesson of everything that happened to our family far more completely than any dollar figure ever could have taught it to him on its own. People ask me sometimes whether I think about what would have happened if I had simply kept driving that night at Grady's Corner, if I had glanced over at an old man padding his pockets and told myself it wasn't my business, that I had my own tank to fill, and my own sleeping son, and my own $23 that needed to last until Monday. And I understand why people ask that question, because it's a genuinely uncomfortable one to sit with. The honest answer is that I don't spend much time there, not because the question doesn't matter, but because I don't think the version of me who would have driven past was ever really available to me in the first place. I was raised by a woman who sent pot roast to a struggling neighbor without a second thought about her own family's tight week, and some things get built into you early enough and consistently enough that they stop being decisions you make and become simply who you are in the moment that calls for them. I didn't give Nate $20 because I calculated it was the right thing to do. I gave it to him because some part of me had already decided, years before I ever pulled into that gas station, exactly what kind of person was going to be standing at that pump. I want to say clearly, because I think it matters more than anything else in this story, that I do not believe kindness like mine gets rewarded with $4 billion very often, or ever. Really, not in any predictable, reliable way you could plan your life around. If you are kind to a stranger, hoping that stranger turns out to be secretly wealthy and secretly grateful in exactly the shape my story turned out, you have already missed the entire point. And worse, I think that hope quietly poisons the kindness itself, turns it into a lottery ticket instead of a decision about who you want to be. What I believe, and what I have tried to build my whole life around since that November night, is something much smaller and much more reliable than a billionaire showing up at your gas pump. I believe that a town like Harlow Springs is actually full of Gradys and Walter Iversons and Ferris Dunbars, ordinary people doing small, unglamorous, often invisible kindnesses for each other every single week, without any expectation that a fortune is riding on any particular one of them, and that those kindnesses matter completely, and completely on their own terms, whether or not a specific $20 bill ever finds its way back to you wrapped in anything larger. If there is one thing I would ask anyone listening to carry away from all of this, it would be this. Be kind on the ordinary Thursdays, the ones nobody is watching, the ones where nothing appears to be riding on the outcome at all. Not because you're waiting for the universe to notice and repay you, because most of the time, statistically, overwhelmingly, it won't. Not in any way you'll ever be able to trace directly back to the kindness itself. Be kind because that is simply who you have decided to be, the way my mother decided it in a kitchen in Harlow Springs decades before any of this happened, the way I decided it at a gas pump on a cold November night without knowing a single thing about who I was actually helping. And then, if you are very fortunate, so rarely fortunate that you should never plan your life around it or resent the years when it doesn't happen, once in a great while it turns out somebody really was keeping score after all, and the $20 you never expected to see again finds its way back to you carrying more than you ever imagined it could hold. Thank you for listening to my family's story tonight. If it moved you even a little, if you believe, the way I've come to believe completely, that quiet decency still matters in a world that so often rewards the loud and the calculating instead, I'd ask you to subscribe to this channel because we share a true story just like this one every single day. Real people, real kindness, real reminders that the world still works this way far more often than the news would ever have you believe. Leave a comment and tell me about a moment in your own life when someone was kind to you for no reason at all, or a moment when you were the one who decided to help a stranger without expecting anything back, because I read every single one. And I promise you, the comments under these stories are sometimes more moving than the stories themselves. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Share this with someone in your life who needs a reminder tonight that the world can still surprise you in good ways, and I will see you in the next story. Take care of each other out there, especially on the ordinary Thursdays when nobody's watching.